Good afternoon, everyone. This is Contacts and Continuities, 500 Years of Asian-Iberian Encounters, an international conference online hosted by Ateneo de Manila University in collaboration with CHANG, Centro de Humanidades Universidade Nueva de Lisboa, and the National Quincentennial Committee of the Republic of the Philippines. It is now 4 p.m. local time. Good afternoon from Manila. We are live streaming on the conference YouTube channel and the National Quincentennial Committee Facebook page. Good afternoon to all in the Zoom room and on social media. The Department of History is happy to host today's panel entitled Difference and Identity, which is the 7th panel in the entire month-long conference series and the second panel of part 2 on legacies of encounter in ideas and identity formation. Yesterday, we heard the opening keynote of Barbara Watson and Daya and panel 6 on gender. Today, we continue the conversation. I am Michael Pante from the Department of History, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon's program. I will be assisted by Dr. Noel Rodriguez and Dr. Nikki Carci Cruz, who will be our community managers. They will help me gather and line up questions for the Q&A as we take questions from within the Zoom room and from our audiences via live stream on YouTube and Facebook. Now, let me give you an idea about our two-part program this afternoon. We start with part 1 with Dr. Fernando Zialcita and Jose Marie Cuartero, and we will have a Q&A immediately after their presentations. We will have a brief 5-minute break, then we go to part 2 with 3 speakers, Regalado Trota Jose, Mark Dizon, and Florentino Rodao, who is joining us from Madrid. We will have another Q&A, and we wrap up at 7 p.m. Philippine time. Let me now introduce our first speaker. Fernando N. Zialcita is Professor Emeritus at the Ateneo de Manila University, where he has been teaching with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. He has written extensively on Philippine culture, including its Hispanic influences, Philippine Ancestral Houses 1810 to 1930, published in 1980 with Martin Pino Jr., The Soul Book, An Introduction to Philippine Pagan Religion, published in 1991 with Francisco Demetrio and Hilda Cordero Fernando, and Authentic Though Not Exotic, Essays on Filipino Identity, published in 2005. He also co-edited Quaresma, Lenten Beliefs and Practices in the Philippines, published in 2000. Dr. Zialcita, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Allow me to share my PowerPoint. Just a minute. Here. There you are. Okay. My topic is really about how conversion paradoxically made us, on the one hand, dissimilar, but at the same time more similar to some of our neighbors in Southeast Asia. I want to start with an experience in West Java. Dusk was falling sometime in the 1990s. I was with my Indonesian student, Harry, and our farmer host in the mountains of West Java. All of a sudden, a siren wailed. What was that for? I asked. Our host explained that actually day had ended. It was 6 o'clock. Night was coming in. So therefore, the spirits were roaming. The implication was that people should stay at home to avoid the spirits. At that very moment, I realized I had met a similar situation before in Bulacan, back in the Philippines, where at 6 o'clock, when the church bells ring for Angelus, parents tell their children to please go home because they might meet spirits who are going out to take the fresh air. So it's very interesting. You have Catholicism in Luzon, Islam in West Java. Yet nonetheless, there was a belief that bridged both parts together.
Dr. Zialcita, sorry to disturb you. Can you kindly share your slides?
Oh,
it's not sharing right now.
Okay. Is it being shared now?
No, not yet. You're sharing your file.
Oh my God. Whew. I guess I have to stop share, right? Or what?
Yeah, stop share first and then go to your slides.
Oh, there you are. Okay. There.
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, so we assume that Westernization has been so strong that the Christianized peoples of lowland Luzon and Visayas have been sundered from Southeast Asia, and that our enduring link with the region must be our Muslim brothers and sisters in Mindanao, because it is assumed that they have not lost their indigenous culture. Um, I would like to critique that Katut, indigenous or Katutubo should be understood in its more basic sense as that which antecedes all foreign external influence. Because if Christianity is once foreign to Southeast Asia, so has Islam been. So I think in looking for the indigenous, we should look for the Austronesian heritage that binds together both Indonesia and Luzon. So conversion to Christianity caused religious expressions of lowland Christian Filipinos to diverge from that of Southeast Asia. We adopted Catholicism and Protestantism, both Western interpretations of Christianity. They came in via colonialism. Yet paradoxically, conversion has made religious expression among lowland Christian Filipinos more similar in form to that of their non-Christian neighbors like Indonesians. I would like to show specifically how food offerings among Christian Ilocanos and Muslim Central Javanese are similar in being both what I call polystranded. So here are the topics: reimagining Southeast Asia, redefining basic concepts, two food offerings, similarity yet difference, and then a parallel milieu. I think when we conceptualize Southeast Asia, we should be careful about defining binary terms as the non-West versus the West. Unintentionally, we exclude the majority of Filipinos, lowland Christian Filipinos. We should look for communalities instead fostered by the indigenous tradition, which remains alive alongside the world religions which entered from India, China, Arabia, and the West. Speaking in even broader terms, we should look at religious practices where various traditions intersect, such as the indigenous and the regionally foreign, and try to understand their interrelationships. Such religious practices characterize the Southeast Asian city, which is really what Filipinos generally think of when they speak of Southeast Asia. They're not thinking about the villages in the mountains. They're really thinking about Southeast Asia. Why city? Why we're so different? So in the Philippines, Katutubo is a catch-all term which covers Muslims of Mindanao who have had powerful monarchical states, and people such as the Tiduray, Manobo, and Kalinga of northern Luzon. We have no traditions of living in states. In contrast, in Malaysia, Orang Asli is applied only to peoples in the uplands who are non-Muslim and live in small autonomous villages. So let's use indigenous as Katutubo as that which has grown to mubo in a locality. Indigenous equals belief or practice that either antecedes an imported belief or practice or else cannot be reduced to it. So the belief that spirits roam the land once the sun sets antecedes both Christianity and Islam. It seems to be an ancient Austronesian belief that is now mixed in with practices drawn from either religion. So what term to use? Syncretism, hybridity, or neither? Syncretism has gotten a bad name because it implies that disparate elements have been blended together. The criticism is that the blending may not be successful. Also, there's a connotation of pure versus impure. On the other hand, hybridity, which has become so popular, has problems too. My perennial objection since before is that hybrid, literally speaking, as defined by the dictionaries in English, refers to an animal or plant of mixed parentage. In other words, a mongrel, anything of a heterogeneous origin of incongruous parts. So I don't think it's pleasant to hear that one's culture is a mongrel, which is exactly what I hear in the Philippines. So how about ambivalence? Philip Nell, South African sociologist, proposes using ambivalence instead. Ambivalence is semantically defined as the coexistence of opposing ideas or feelings in the mind or in a single context. It refers to the reality in which ideas or practices assumed to be mutually exclusive coexist in a meaningful manner. I think this is much more what I'm looking for. Its logic is not binary but dialectical because it accepts differences. However, ambivalent sounds negative too, so I'm suggesting polystranded instead. I'm thinking, for example, of a wall hanging like what Rafi Napay does, of which one example in the Ateneo Gallery, where you have threads of different fabrics, of different textures, different materials that sometimes interweave, but that sometimes just hang or sometimes they're in a tangle. Because I think culture, after all, is never finished as a project. So my point is that Christianity, like Islam, has made a local religious expression like the Ilocano food offering and the Javanese food offering uh, polystranded in form and meaning. Religious world religions are translocal. At the same time, they're watched over by religious specialists whose reflexivity concerning written scriptures results in differing interpretations. So let's talk about the Atang. So the Ilocos coast has been influenced to Western culture since the 1590s. However, the preeminence of Catholicism is now contested by other religions. I'm basing my discussion of Atang on actual experience because although not Ilocano, I did a lot of my field work there. So I've lived in hamlets as well as in cities in Lawag and Vigan. So what is Atang for? Um, According to one friend, sometimes it's because of a physical ailment that doesn't go away. It could be a celebration, an offering is made at the family altar so that the ancestral spirits can join in the fun. It could be to avert bad luck because there was the case of this big educational institution whose bids for project failed, so they decided to have a pig roasted as lechon and offered. So when they made another bid, this time they had luck. It's also an ease in an unaccustomed situation. Supposing you go to a farm and you're surrounded by trees, you never know what the spirits are thinking and feeling. So who are the spirits? These may be Kiban or Duende residing in the house and its surroundings since before, ancestral spirits, or nameless spirits of nature, especially unfamiliar surroundings. So what kind of food is offering? Rice crepes, rice cakes, mounds of rice, or any food offerings, or any native cakes that are special, together with cigarettes, basi, nganga, or gin, or even party food can be offered. Sometimes something as plain as sugar can be enough. So what prayers are said? Yes, there are prayers that are non-Catholic, like the prayers recited by Manggagamud, but there are also prayers recited like the rosary itself. So let me see now. And anybody can lead the prayers, whether male or female. So is the food eaten? No, generally not during the taboo period, not after the prayers have been recited. People agree on a taboo day, like one whole day or one whole night. Afterwards, however, there are some men who purposely feast on the food because they say it makes them more strong, mas lalaki ka. Not all, however, agree to this practice. So while many Catholics simply look at this as a cultural practice, others feel uneasy because This means catering to environmental spirits. However, there are also those non-Catholics, like evangelical Christians, who insist on a literal reading of the Bible and believe that any accommodation with local belief systems is paganism. Let's now go to Islamitan. Now, Central Java has been exposed to Indian influences since the 9th century. Um, then came in Hindu Islam in the 14th century, which eventually became the majority religion. So what is it for? Any number of these activities: birth, marriage, sorcery, death, house moving, bad dreams, harvest, name changing, opening a factory, illness, application of village, guardian spirit, circumcision, the starting of political meeting. The idea is to foster equality, at the same time protect the host from spirits so they will not upset him. Who are the spirits? A wide variety. You have those who merely frighten humans but sometimes can make humans disappear. Then you have the lelembut, the type that precisely wanders around sunset. Then you have the demits or guardians of places such as a banyan tree or the ruins of Hindu temple. So how is it conducted? The host sends a messenger to houses in his neighborhood to announce that the Islamitan will take place. So the guests come in, incense is burned, the host stands up, explains what it's all about. Then he asks one of the member of the group to recite prayers. It's very interesting that these prayers invoke the spirits of the village, young and old, male and female, and that on special occasions, a mosque official leads the prayers. So food is served to the host, but the host himself does not eat. The food is served in banana leaf dishes together with a cup of tea. And then after that, everybody leaves. But it is believed, of course, that in the course of the Islamitan, the spirits themselves are feasting thanks to the aroma. So there are special foods, generally several kinds of fish, chicken, or beef. Now, in East Java, which is more Islamic than Central Java, Beatty, an anthropologist, notes the significance of the red and white porridge. White represents the father's semen, and red the mother's procreative blood. Therefore, Adam and Eve, respectively. However, there's a third element which energizes the mixture. They call it Vishnu or Vishnu. This is divine element. There are conflicting interpretations because, on the one hand, you have mystically oriented Muslims, those in of Sufi orientation, who accept all the symbolisms because they think they all refer to universal values. Never mind if they refer to ancient gods. However, Orthodox Muslims approve of Islamitan only if it is purged of its incense and allusions to deities and as a more Islamic prayer. In between are ordinary people who defer to both sides but continue to practice Islamitan. So how are they dissimilar yet similar? There's an obvious dissimilarity. Um, Catholicism is practiced in one, Islam in the other. Another dissimilarity is that in Ilocos, either gender may convoke friends and lead the prayers, whereas in Central Java, it's strictly a male affair. So are we supposed to denigrate the Ilocano version because it does not conform to our vision of um, what Southeast Asia is, which is tends to be largely Islamic? I think we would be untrue to ourselves. So Islam is in some ways more patriarchal. Um, as we can see here, um, the women may preside even at prayers like Novena, Rosary, although of course only the priests preside at the major liturgy, which is that of the Mass. In this respect, the westernized Christianized Ilocano is closer than the Javanese to the Austronesian tradition. There's another similarity, however. In both, spirits consume the food offerings, yes. At the same time, however, imported traditions are used. Both Islam and Christianity originated in the Near East. They're Abrahamic faiths. At the same time, Hinduism and Buddhism are foreign imports. Um, we must remember that, after all, Sanskrit, like Latin, belongs to the Indo-Aryan family. So it's interesting how Spanish terms like duende, espiritu mix in, whereas in Central Java, terms from Sanskrit, Pali, and Arabic are mixed in with these practices. So Arabic is chanted in Islamitans. In Ilocos, English may be used for the rosary, but I think more ordinarily, it's really Ilocano that's used. Another similarity is that there's an ambivalence between indigenous animism and imported monotheism. In animism, spirits are many. They are in different places and are capricious. Christianity and Islam, however, claim there is but one God. He has dominion over the entire cosmos, including good spirits and bad spirits. Technically, the spirits feared by Ilocanos and Central Javanese are not mentioned in the Bible or the Quran. They're not devils. They're not interested in tempting an individual to do evil. They just want to be left alone, or else they're willing to do favors in exchange for a meal. So there's an incompatibility. Both Christianity and Islam battled against polytheism and animism. Yet, in these two rituals, their prayers are being used to win favors from spirits roaming about, um, all of which are not even mentioned in the holy books. There's a third similarity. Um, in both, there is a dialectic between purity of interpretation versus unquestioning acceptance of traditional beliefs. So, whereas you find Ilocanos who either accept or sometimes do not accept um, the 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 Atang, the same thing also happens in Java. There are those who accept and those who feel uneasy because they don't seem to conform with Orthodox Islamic belief. So what I would say is that the reason for the polystrandedness is because of what I would call an urbanizing divide. It has to do with the city. It's a settlement where most of the residents no longer depend primarily upon agriculture. Um, People here specialize in a particular non-farming occupation. As a result, there's a divide between mental and manual labor. As a result, you have people who spend much of their time focusing on religious scriptures, focusing on rituals, seeking purification. So there are two traditions that emerge. One is elite, the other popular. Elite focusing on the city, popular focusing on the lower margins of the city as well as in the rural villages. A city tends to be larger and more nucleated than the rural village. It's more heterogeneous. So your people are forced to stay with people from who are originally traders and migrants. So they're more open to outside influences. At the same time, they're more open to self-questioning because, after all, there are libraries, there are archives where the scriptures are kept. So there's constant reflection on the meaning of the Holy Scriptures. And here I show a parallel between a mosque with a dome in Central Java and the Church of San Fernando in Pampanga. I couldn't find a church with a dome in Ilocos. Note that in pre-Hispanic villages of Luzon and Visayas, religious worship took place either at natural sites or in the house of a chief. So when did the urbanizing divide begin in Luzon and Visayas? According to the urban geographer Robert Reed, when European colonialists entered Southeast Asia in the 16th century, in comparison to Java, Malay Peninsula, Cambodia, Siam, Burma, and I would say Vietnam, only Luzon and Visayas did not have true cities, precisely because of the structural features listed above. The reason for this, according to Reed, was that Sweden, rather than rice cultivation, was more widespread. If you practice Sweden, you cannot have permanent settlements because the farm must be shifted after 3 years to allow the forest to take over. So it was Catholic missionaries who popularized the plow, albeit in its Chinese and European form. So the converts began to live in permanent settlements around the church. Parishes grew into urban centers. So about Tondo, well, it's a big question. I'd much rather not discuss it. Okay. So the paradox, therefore, is this: even as Catholic Luzon diverged from Muslim Java, it converged with the latter in developing an an urbanizing divide, where within one religion, different traditions meet and have ambivalent relationships with each other. The polystranded condition persists to this day. Before concluding, I just want to show that there's a parallelism also in Thai Buddhism, because in Thai Buddhism, there's also a divide between the Buddhism preached by the Sangha in Bangkok and the actual Buddhism practiced in the hinterlands, in the villages. Um, Buddhism practices detachment, enlightenment, but popular Buddhism um, stresses attaining fertility, prosperity, and success. So, what is my conclusion, therefore? As we Filipinos participate ever more intensively in Southeast Asia, um, a fear pursues us that Christianization and Westernization have alienated us permanently from the rest of the region. We should be aware of this simplistic binary contrast. Christianization did not wipe out indigenous practices and beliefs, nor did Islamization do that either. Indigenous practices and beliefs persist to this day, as can be observed comparing offerings in Ilocos and Central Java. Um, Accommodations are made with a dominant religious discourse emanating from the urban centers. The indigenous sense persists. So the urbanizing divide has brought in theologies which spread to the villages. What has resulted is the ambivalent coexistence of beliefs and practices from different traditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Xiaocita. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Jose Marie Cuartero. Jose Marie Cuartero is a faculty member of the English department at the Ateneo de Manila University, and he teaches classes in literature and globalization and the interdisciplinary relationship between literature and the social sciences. His research interests have been defined by the Folklore archive of Isabela de los Reyes, and at present, he is expanding such a research interest by also integrating it with cultural anthropology, specifically through the concepts of care and suffering. He's also currently doing a curatorial research residency under the Sandbox program of Arete Art Gallery of the Ateneo de Manila. Some of his writings have appeared in Critica Cultura and Philippine Studies. Mr. Cuartero, you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So good afternoon. I'm Jomar Cuartero. So it's just, an honor to come after an Ilocos expert, Professor Xiaocita. So let me start. So the title of my paper is Los Vulgos ante Europa, the Folklore Archive of Isabela de los Reyes. What constitutes the folk in the Folklore Archive of Isabela de los Reyes, especially that the folk is a conceptual invention by European civilization? What does the folk signify in the process of representing them during the tail end of 19th century, with the prevailing anti-colonial nationalism at the heart of the mutinies, rebellion, and even revolution all over the country? How does folklore as an archive of 19th century advance a critique of colonial history that has been shaped simultaneously by Europe? The folk as an epistemological rubric appears in the activist imagination of De los Reyes by the tail end of the 19th century with the publication of the classic El Folklore Filipino, which is first written as articles for different newspapers, and with his active engagement to discuss the quotidian life of the Ilocos region, these articles have evolved into a book that has found an organic synergy by looking at the ideas from these texts as a curation of ideas to be studied about the past, a preservation of the life of the indigenous effaced by the expanding industrial modernity, and an archival representation in which the folk would be allowed to speak, especially with the consequences of the violence of the letter as the philocracy invent an idea of the colonial subjects. The folk, in other words, is an attempt to imagine what William Henry Scott calls the creation of a cultural minority within the cracks of the parchment curtain, whose signifying chain of the Filipino folk can be found only through inscriptions, traces, and signs that can be germinal for us to recognize a folk's personhood organic in one's material conditions. Precisely in the attempt to articulate the materiality of the folk formation in the works of De los Reyes, my paper foregrounds in three parts the meaning making of the folk. The first one is the naming of the folk at the heart of the place making, the originary presence of Ilocos against a chronological notion of colonial history, and the last one, the translation of Bulgos as before Europe. We have to realize that the recognition of the folk, however, does not mean that the folk is absolutely free of having traces of coloniality. Instead, the folk of De los Reyes is part of the European legacy, and such participation in the discursive production of the folk has also been part of his active engagement with folklore scholars across Europe. De los Reyes acknowledges at the onset that the term folklore has a British provenance, for it can be traced back as a word in the Saxon language, and such knowledge is drawn from being representative of the Filipino folklore under the leadership of the Boletín Folclórico Sevilla in Spain. Such opportunity for De los Reyes arrives at his doorstep through the encouragement and generosity of Felipe del Pan, who has provided the space for his folkloric interests, whether about his hometown Ilocos or other places like Malabon and Zambales, until he expands it in a more encompassive way by turning these ethnicities under the unified rubric of Folklore Filipino. Apart from Del Pan, who supported his intellectual work, Spanish folklorist and anthropologist Machado y Alvarez and Alejandro Guichot y Sierra have provided references for De los Reyes. They have stimulated him even with the absence of popular response to his work. In this sense, the arrival of folklore has been a simultaneous recognition of the locality of specific spaces within the colonial platforms of newspapers, dailies, and broadsheets circulated through the use of Spanish language. As a result, De los Reyes is also in contact with people in Spain who are practicing folklore and are also using such concept to recognize different localities. However, at the same time, folklore has evolved with a hegemonic force within the international arena of scholarship. Such international arena of scholarship is the continental formation of Europe, that is also in a state of what Zygmunt Bauman calls adventure by the 19th century, in which the idea of Europe is on the one hand born from the folkloric tradition of tales, epics, mythologies, but also the experience of crossing territories, navigating uncharted bodies of water, and seizing communities of the primitive other. The coloniality of the folk, The coloniality of the folk as a result becomes also De los Reyes' adventure to know other communities outside of Manila, such as his beloved hometown, Ilocos, but also other communities like Malabon and Zambales. The coloniality of the folk exposes the latitude of colonialism that brings even the innocent folk into the process of defining the social and territorial differences, which force them to identify the conditions of deferment by establishing as to those who would belong to the folk collectivity or who would be perpetually excluded. The folk is ironically within the breadth of the expansiveness of the coloniality of Europe. Despite the latitude of the coloniality of Europe, the folk establishes their respective habitations in Malabon, Zambales, and Ilocos, as articulated by De los Reyes through his ethnographic writing. Such genre has enabled a comparative critique of Manila in terms of the city's labor expandability, the projection of a hierarchy among different ethnicities, and its concentration of capital. In a chapter devoted to Malabon in El Folklore Filipino, De los Reyes describes this place. It must be noted that almost everything that has so far been said about the people of Malabon is also true of other Tagalogs, which implies the stereotype that treat them as inferior in comparison to those who mostly come from cosmopolitan international city like Manila. The stereotype against those from Malabon is further pursued by De Los Reyes by arguing that if only Filipinos were as industrious and intelligent as the people of Malabon, the economic triumph of these islands would be assured. These sentiments of De Los Reyes reveal his disgust by the kind of expectations people have on those who come from this area. The ignorance that most people have on the nature of the lives of the Malabon folk, and how uncritical sentiments lead to hierarchies in terms of ethnicities, but also as an economic privilege. The complexity of the folk from Malabon is further explained by De Los Reyes by revealing that there were thus many Chinese mestizos and many illegitimate offspring. That is why the people of Malabon are more hardworking than other Tagalogs. It is said that they and the Boholanos are the only Filipinos that can be compared to the hardworking Ilocanos. Such complexity emphasizes Malabon on the one hand as influenced by the culture of the enterprising nature of Chinese migrants, and on the other hand, they are diachronically identified with Ilocanos who exemplify as hard work's pinnacle. However, despite laying down the complexity of the folk from Malabon, the infrastructural reality of Manila hinders as well the Tagalogs from appreciating the wealth of labor from this place. The alleys would have been replaced by good roads. Instead, the streets connecting Malabon to Manila have become famous for their bad state of repair, especially during the rainy season. This implies how Malabon is also infrastructurally dismembered from the city capital of Manila. And such marginality is what Marxist John Milius theorized as the alien nature in the sphere of capitalist social relations. What gets to be revealed in the location of the life world of Malabon is how the concept of relations of production involves a distributive process of dividing people into classes while simultaneously constituting them as social subjects. And in turn, the folk from Malabon unfolds as classes who are born out of the antagonism inherent in this distributive process, whether in terms of social recognition, labor opportunities, infrastructural development, and capital investments. These ethnographic writings on Malabon, Zambales, and at large Ilocos are writing cultures that trace the politics of class formations, and thereby the writing in itself is a process of figuration within the complicated dynamics of class struggle in which Manila holds a singular dominance against the plurality of exemplary otherness. The conditions of otherness of those outside Manila precisely enabled De Los Reyes to publish in the 1890s a two-volume book on the history of Ilocos that comprises chapters on the ethnological, philological, and even pre-colonial history of the said region before El Folklore Filipino. Such interest in the history of Ilocos locates what Jacques Derrida calls originary difference for the folk against a colonial government and colonial history that has rendered them almost invisible or a people without history. And only through traces, sporadic ethnographic accounts, and other folkloric narratives they gain a historical visibility. This condition of the Ilocanos definitely could be understood as a consequence of a cultural stereotype. De Los Reyes writes, they are the servant of choice in Manila because they are respectful and hardworking and loyal. However, despite the quality of labor they render to their respective masters in Manila, they have not, however, been closely studied because no intelligent and studious persons have gone to Ilocos. Or if there were some who had done so, they obviously lack the time and patience to undertake such study. With the dearth of interest on Ilocos, De Los Reyes took the initiative. No one that I know of has attempted to write the history of Ilocos. I undertook to write the history of Ilocos beginning with the circumstances in which Salcedo found the Ilocanos, thereby preserving the memory of events that occurred in the region, and finally putting together materials for the writing of a conscientious history that is not based on a commentary or imagination. However, in another work of de los Reyes in 1888, El Diablo, a dialogue that stages a satire on our ideas of evilness, the Diablo and the good, critiques also chronistas of Spanish colonial history who have invented the Diablo in the world of the folk by evoking the feelings of horror and terror out of the strange sightings of animals or the mystical experience of the folk, which serve as the substance of their chronological account of history. As a result, the practice of writing history of the folk de los Reyes is an effort to establish what would serve as the traces that reveal the originary presence of the folk, and also a recognition of their difference within the chronological history that the Spanish colonial government supports. Thus, it becomes no surprise, Thus, it becomes no surprise that de los Reyes would complain that in writing this history, I do not even have a model to show me how to write one for a province. The writings about Ilocos, Malabon, and Zambales against the continuing chronological history of the state-sponsored cronistas are acts of deferment, as well as of such continuity of colonial history. And as de los Reyes argues for the folk, this serves as a reprisal against the violence also of the writing, in which the ultimate grammar of time in history could only be told at large within the continuity of Spanish colonialism. The folk in such case is a collectivity that resists a monolithic formation. And de los Reyes uses the word vulgos, which is translated by Salud Dizon and Maria Eleonora Peralta Imson as people. De los Reyes writes, El folklore recoge del vulgo, or in the translation, folklore is gathered from the people. The vulgo is translated into people who are the bearers of the story of the ghosts, the spirits, the healers, the sea, and other superstitious beliefs, which can be seen as ideas that are unscientific, ignorant, and even primitive. However, precisely, despite the unfavorable depiction of the epistemology among the vulgos, de los Reyes believes that there is none other than the science of folklore whose aim is to collect the customs, legends, traditions, superstitions, architecture, painting, modes of dress, popular music, vocabulary, and grammar of both the civilized and uncivilized peoples to safeguard them from the progress which tends to put all races with their steamships, train tracks, commercial activity, and the telegraph on an equal footing. As the colonial modernity advances into the countryside, the vulgos do not merely emerge as a collective representation of otherness, but its nominative presence impedes the speed of colonial expansion, disrupts the growing inequality brought by a new world making of such colonial history. And as the vulgos vulgarize the legacies of European Enlightenment, whether through the practice of folk Catholicism, beliefs in traditional medicine, and fascination with mythological beliefs, the vulgos as a folk community established their presence. Collective presence within the before and after the very invention of the idea of Europe, from the rise and fall of Spanish colonialism, and then eventually with the birth of American imperialism, which by the turn of the 20th century, de los Reyes publishes a newspaper entitled Filipinas ante Europa. The vulgos become a collective personhood that provides a placemaking for the Philippines despite being bereft of privilege as empires are at odds in claiming their respective territorial dominance. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Jomar. And now we invite members of the audience here in the Zoom meeting to either type questions in the chat box or raise your hands to ask your questions directly. We will also gather questions from social media, which Noel Rodriguez or Nikki Carsi Cruz will relay to us. So if there are questions, I think Ruth Deliobe is raising her hand. Can you please?
Hi, hello.
Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Cialcita. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. What I'm always like struck, and I think we had conversations about this topic in the past, is why do you think that this idea of like Filipinos not being enough Southeast Asians or being like kind of like not enough indigenous in some ways comes from? It is like something inherited from a Western perspective of Southeast Asia that is articulated around this idea of or this orientalization of Southeast Asia, that if a country or a space or political space doesn't have a pre-colonial civilization, then it has a question mark on top of it, or
No.
is a construction of all the reconstruction, the folklore, and all the reconstruction that the Ilustrados made of the Filipino past.
I think it's more simple than that. It's really this binary we work on, Westernized versus non-Westernized. In fact, that is unfortunately the way we classify indigenous versus non-indigenous in the Philippines. In other words, we bring together Muslims and hitherto tribal Filipinos. I hate to use the word tribal, but I have to use it in this context. We bring them into one extreme, non-Westernized. The other extreme would be Westernized, namely us. So it's very misleading to use a Western versus non-Western binary. I think we should refrain from doing that, because what happens is that the majority of Filipinos, Luzon, Visayas, think they don't have an indigenous culture, whereas in fact, the indigenous tradition is so alive in the countryside, in Ilocos,
yes,
in the Tagalog area, in Visayas. As I mentioned, Ilocanos still believe in all their spirits of the environment. It's so alive. And in fact, I just realized this actually is what confusing the food scene. So I have culinary friends who say, okay, we must serve Maranao food, Tausug food, because this is a kind of food we had which connects us with Southeast Asia. This is the food we had before colonialism came. I found that rather strange, because if you look at the early chronicles, the food in Cebu and in Luzon was really simple. It was not spiced heavily. It was really just seafood with salt and rice. And Ilocano food is much closer actually to the indigenous tradition, because it relies heavily in bagoong, and a lot of it is actually uncooked. There's a lot of blood, which is very indigenous. So we have to be careful about the binary, Western versus non-Western.
No, I was wondering because like kind of reading about Megan Thomas and all her work on basically how the Ilustrados construct this past, and then in some ways because they were educated in the West, that they brought maybe. I keep wondering if what is this binary comes from.
I don't think it's the Ilustrados per se. It's the binary used throughout the world, Western versus non-Western. It's so widespread.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Now, are there other questions from our Zoom participants? If you have questions, kindly raise your hand. Use the raise hand button. Yes, Kwatamo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Celcita. The question of the mixing the religion and the interpretation, general standard interpretation about Christianity in the Philippines, generally consider that the Christianity in Philippines is a fait accompli. It's something that happened all the way, and is numbers only, how many Christians are. However, probably the interpretation should go precisely by this non-binary vision, and understand that there are different ways of syncretism in different parts, regions, etc. It's very attractive the way that you express that this phenomenon happened also with the Muslim in Muslim areas, or with the Buddhism in Thailand. This is something really attractive because open the window for interpretation. In the case of New Spain and the case of modern Mexico, some of the new lines of interpretations are precisely in that area, because Even the conquest itself has been questioned in this moment after 500 years. That is the commemoration of the arrival of the Spaniards, and the Christianization of New Spain and also Peru was not straightforward and not uniform. That's why it create a mosaic of expressions that are this kind of syncretism between indigenous culture and the arrival of Christianity. Thank you so much for that opening in the interpretation. And essentially that.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very familiar with the Mexican literature on mixing of cultures, mestizaje. Except I didn't want to use the word mestizaje because in the Philippines, when you speak of mestizo, people think you mean somebody's pure white. The idea of mixture has been lost already. We tend to associate mestizo here with somebody's purely European.
Right.
I'm also familiar with the fact that in the Mexican literature, mestizaje, they allow for contradictions between European and local traditions. It's not necessarily a blending. But anyway, for purposes of this talk, I decided, okay, might as well develop a new term, polystranded.
Correct. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cuauhtemoc, for your insights. There, Patricia Silvestre. Hi, Patricia. You may now unmute your... Patricia, yes?
Hi.
Please. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jalcita, for the talk. You were saying that the indigenous is very much alive until now, and I agree very much with that. And coming from musicology, I just like to point out a few examples in music, and when we talk about religion and the mixing of influences, like for example, the pabasa is one good example, using a indigenous vocal technique and the Western text and indigenous performance practice. And then there's also what we call the sanghyang in Cavite. It's a healing rite. On one hand, the people are praying to the icons of Catholicism, the Virgin Mary, and on the other hand, they also pray simultaneously to other spirits such as the Hari ng Kailaliman and San Juan Sambanog, P1, and all of that. And there's a lot of food offerings being made and playing around with fire in the hands. So it's fascinating. There are so many other examples that we can think of in terms of religious folk traditions, the sinulog, the subli, and the list goes on. And this makes the musical cultural landscape of the Philippines very excitingly diverse.
Thank you, Patricia. Actually, it's very interesting. In Ateneo, we think we're so far away from the indigenous world, but if you go to one of these tricycle celebrations, somebody just got a new tricycle. What does he do? He slaughters chicken and pours the blood on this tricycle right on Katipunan. And then if you go to Ateneo de Zamboanga, Ateneo de Davao, I've had this experience where me and other guests were welcomed by a student group. What did they do? Somebody danced around with a live chicken. Then all of a sudden, in the middle of the dancing, that dancer bit into the neck of the chicken to kill it. This happened in Ateneo de Zamboanga, Ateneo de Davao. So indigenous tradition is definitely very alive, even in Catholic schools.
Yes, even what we call Católicos cerrados, they believe in anting and all of that, and tabi-tabi po. Just
well, I'll tell you something. Now that you mentioned Católico cerrado, I have this famous publisher friend who's telling me about her balae, the mother-in-law of her son. She's supposed to be a member of a very conservative Catholic organization. Now, when her son and the bride finally had their own house, she was surprised to find that at the steps to the house was a slaughtered chicken. She was surprised. The blood had been splattered on the steps.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, Jomar, I think perhaps for the benefit of our viewers who are not familiar with Isabelo de los Reyes, and for us immersed in Philippine studies, we are definitely familiar with the guy. But maybe for the sake of those who are not yet familiar with Isabelo de los Reyes, especially his connections with the Ilustrados, since we've been talking about the Ilustrados in light of the first question. So can you give our viewers a quick introduction, perhaps, and what was Isabelo de los Reyes' significance, especially in relation to Ilustrado culture?
All right. So Isabella de los Reyes is basically an important figure in Philippine history, but still remains to be, I think, quite unpopular, especially that our attention has always been about Jose Rizal or Andres Bonifacio. So it's only like recently that there is a resurgence in the study of the works or the archive of Isabella de los Reyes. I describe Isabella de los Reyes essentially as a polymath who is basically the father of everything, the pioneer and the visionary of all fields, labor history. I remember Dr. Zialcita, even like I was asking him, should we classify him as the father of Philippine anthropology? And he said yes. So I thank him for that. So he's also a philologist. And there was a question about, in relation to like Orientalism and which I think someone was referring to Megan Thomas. If you go back to the work of Megan Thomas, Megan Thomas is making a new argument for Orientalism that it's not just basically a reduction of the social capacity of the Orient, but rather in the case of the Philippines, Orientalist knowledges have been instrumentalized as a revolutionary tool, and Isabella de los Reyes is one of them. So he did philology, he did theology, he established the Iglesia Dependiente Filipina, and he translated the Holy Bible. He has done a lot of things that I don't think I could handle um, within my lifetime. So that's why I describe him as a polymath. Now, in terms of the Ilustrado, of course, our traditional definition of the Ilustrado is the enlightened, but definitely I would like to also make a claim about his being Ilustrado as someone that is not within the same mold or a life way that Rizal and others had. His exposure to Western Europe was because of a punishment, as he was actually sent to Spain to the Montjuic Castle for his crimes in the Philippines. So he did not have the same privilege, although he comes from a family that is very educated, right? And specifically with his mother, Leona Florentino, who's basically the town poet of Ilocos. So in the sense, Isabella de los Reyes is somehow an important figure that only a few have basically given emphasis, like William Henry Scott, Benedict Anderson, Fernando Llanes, Megan Thomas. What else? I think people did not even know that Dolores Feria actually wrote a chapter on the mother of Isabella de los Reyes. So he is still the unrecognized, but a highly productive and highly prolific man of the 19th century who actually lived until the rise of American imperialism in the Philippines. So that's how I would describe the wealth of life that Isabella de los Reyes had. So there.
Okay. May I say something about Isabella de los Reyes?
Sure, Dr.
Because it's
Sati,
actually
go
one
ahead.
of my idols.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I idolize him because he was not afraid to confront or to speak of the indigenous past as it was. He didn't try to sanitize it. If there was a human sacrifice, he mentioned it. Whereas I get the sense that some of the other ilustrados like Rizal were uneasy with all this mention of violence and bloodshed because they were afraid Europeans would look down on Filipinos. So Isabella de los Reyes and Rizal actually got into an argument over that, over the extent to which slavery was practiced in pre-Hispanic Philippines. Um, in fact, the Rizal and company despised Isabella de los Reyes as provinciano, which I think was very unfair because, yeah, he's from province and he's very proud of it. very proud of the fact that Ilocos is different from the Tagalog region. So I appreciate the fact that he talked a lot about the ancient rituals in Ilocos, which are bloody, and I don't think anybody should have to apologize for it, because after all, the ancient rituals in other countries in pre-Christian Europe were bloody also. They were violent. So that's why I appreciate Isabella de los Reyes a lot.
Can I just also add? I think, yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Zialcita. I think that's also the same reason with his ability not to censor the violence, and at the same time perhaps the primitivism of the folk in certain aspects of their lives, and that's precise. These are the driving force for me to even give emphasis further on the concept of vulgos as something that I always phrase as ante-Europa, which is an inspiration from his newspaper Filipinas Ante-Europa, where that newspaper is very important in the sense that he actually declared there that he anticipated America would become a more violent society in comparison to Spain. And he thought, he knew that, America would evolve into a very destructive capitalist nation. And thinking when I was reading that, where did he get that? How did he, where did he get that kind of theorizing at the turn of the 20th century? But what is important there is that when he was anticipating that, I thought, okay, he was actually also making a comparison between Europe and United States. And at the same time, what struck me in when I was writing my thesis, Patrick Flores was asking me, what is so distinct about his writing that people seem not to notice that can be like a conceptual force in his work. And that's where I started to capitalize on vulgos, because I noticed that he does, when you open the first chapter of El Folklore Filipino, he doesn't use the word there folk, but he used the word there vulgo, which is translated by Imson and Peralta as the folk. And in the course of my research, I realized that vulgo is actually an important category in folklore studies, specifically in the golden age of Spanish history, or Siglo del Oro. Until recently, I saw the other day that there's a book about the hesitancy of Spain in 17 something. Ian McLadwell, I think that's the name, who's talking about the vulgo as this class formation that is somehow hated because precisely they embody this vulgar nature of the plebeian, the peasant, etc. And I think because of these concepts, I realized that the folk that De Los Reyes is advancing is not just just, and I appreciate where Dr. Zialcita tried to deconstruct our stereotypes in terms of thinking about the binary of the West and the East. And I feel like in the case of De Los Reyes, his contribution here is he's trying to vulgarize the existence of the binarism in the way we look at colonial history. I think that's what I'm going to say.
Thanks for that wonderful exchange of ideas, Jomar and Dr. Zialcita. And by the way, we're still open to questions. Maybe some of you would want to explore this Ilocano connection even further. It's nice that we are finding this deep Ilocano connection between the first and second presentations. So for people in our Zoom room, people watching via YouTube, you may still forward us your questions if you still have some queries you want to. Yes, Patricia. Yes.
Hello, hi again. Like Dr. Zialcita, I admire Isabella so much because he was into so many things, as pointed out by our speaker. He had his hand dipped in so many things, and he wasn't afraid of diving into controversy, which got him into a lot of trouble also. But I also would like to comment on the use of his of the word Filipino for him, because it was not restrictive. For him, Filipino was, as Scott says, no, they were both Igorot and Ilustrado alike, no. So he was not restrictive nor inclusive, but of course it was an imperfect notion at that time of nation. and then also drawing from my musicological background, because I dug into the newspapers that Isabello wrote. He wrote a lot of folk. He wrote on the folk in newspapers like La Otienia Española and La Lectura Popular, and he was a very musical person, and he even translated the libretto of the opera Aida into Ilocano.
My God.
Yes, he was all over the place. It's a fascinating creature.
And he had 4 wives.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
I think that's why I'm really drawn to the concept of vulgo, which can be loosely translated as vulgar, because the fascinating about that, decision to use in the text is it also resists the finitude that is always expected by Enlightenment ideas. So yeah, and that's true that he has written so many things that we are still, I think, yet to discover, because there are times with Isabella that, he also used nom de guerre, so you're not sure if, that's his or someone else. I remember when I was working on this dialogue El Diablo, and my professor was like, having a problem with my draft, because somehow the problem with the text is that the name of the characters were Isabello and Gaspar, I think Gatmaitan, and it was like she was wondering, are you citing Isabello the scholar, or Isabello the character? So he has that kind of very outrageous, and I would even say anarchic imagination of the 19th century. I think there's a comment from Antonio de Castro. The folk is anglicized German word vogue, and vulgus is the Latin. This is true. There is, of course, the Germanic history also, which Isabello de los Reyes actually cites. He cites the Grimm brothers, in fact, in the introduction. So he's aware, he's so aware of what was happening in folklore studies. And after all, folklore was really strong at that time, okay? I think my beef, however, is that in terms of like the folklore history, it is where by the turn of the American colonial history, American imperial history rather, when they started writing these encyclopedia and narratives about the emergence of folklore, that's where, and I feel like, this is my argument, that the American imperialism has gradually dimmed the light of Isabella de los Reyes. In some encyclopedias, he doesn't appear as part of the history of folklore. Usually it would start with, some American folklorists going to the Philippines. So there's American imperial history somehow eclipse de los Reyes, but especially that he's also known as, a known critic of American imperialism. And we can see this how William Henry Scott documented this history of his life.
Thanks. I think Ruth, were you raising your hand?
Yeah,
Really?
I was raising my hand, but I didn't want to disturb the conversation.
No, Rob. Yeah, you can ask your question now.
No, I was thinking about the concept of vulgo that you are using, that Isabel de los Reyes. I think I agree with you in the sense that there is this connotation, there's the Siglo de Oro, and however, at the same time, it has a very social structure, and in some ways reflects a bit what Spanish colonialism is. It's not only articulated around race, but it's around status, and how the importance of the social class. And I think it's interesting the use of the word vulgo is kind of like very, and also is even dramatic in some ways.
Thank you for that, Ruth. I mean, it's so like on point when you said these things, because if you look at the history of Isabello, he's basically a socialist, and at the same time a pioneer, the father of the Philippine Labor Union. So he's aware of the class, and this is something that I also want to bring in the reading of Isabello de los Reyes, the aspect of class struggle, which I think is like appearing especially if we look at the way he describes Malabon in comparison to Manila. So and that's also, and thank you for saying that, because it makes me more inspired to like pursue further the concept of vulgos.
By the way, there's a comment by Father De Castro, which I'd like to comment on too. I thought very, very interesting. He said that, in both the Quran and the Bible, there's a whole cosmology of spirits. He says there cannot be a one-to-one correspondence. Yes, in fact, I'm just saying that actually the spirits that we find in Ilocos and Java roaming the countryside are not really evil. They're just there. They're playful. If you get in the way, they get irritated with you, but they're not going to tempt you. They're not after getting your soul, unlike the devil in the Bible. The devil wants to control your soul, not the spirits that roam the countryside in the Philippines or Java.
Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Shasita. We still have room for further questions. Because if there are none, I have a question for the two of you, Jomar and Dr. Shasita. And I just want to ask this in light of what's trending right now. And that is the popularity of the Netflix series 13. Are you?
Yes,
I think a lot of us here in the Zoom room and maybe our audience watching via YouTube are kind of want to ask the impact of 13. Do you think it can have this impact on further popularizing Philippine folklore, and how I hate to use the word authentic, but how authentic, if you have seen 13, how
yeah, I have.
authentic was 13's depiction of Philippine folklore? Have you seen it, Dr. Shashita?
Yes,
Jomar?
yes.
Yes.
All the
Okay.
6 episodes.
Yes.
I've read actually the comics at one point, and I think my answer to that is, well, folklore has a long history in the Philippines. And I think it's even like highly contested by some, especially that folklore has, on the one hand, has been utilized during the Cold War era in the Philippines to actually attack, leftists and communists, and they use the language of folklore to advance, counterinsurgency policies. But on the other hand, the way I see it, and because I taught also at one point folklore in my IE class, on the one hand, I mean, I think there's a neoliberal turn in the folklore right now, because the way I see folklore right now is that this is the fascination of how I think the folklore right now is different from, for example, the 19th century folklore of Isabella de los Reyes, in the sense that the folklore right now has become, for me, becoming this new age, commercial cultural industry where you see like, I mean, I tell my students, I'm so fascinated that most Athenians now are buying tarot cards at Fully Book, which doesn't really happen before. Like, I'm surprised a lot of my students are so into astrology, etc. Right? And then they're asking me if I know fortune tellers, etc. Or so I think the way I see Trece is coming from this new wave of like, how our society is actually finding a way to get out of, the extent that neoliberal capitalism has shaped our lives. And somehow the mystical, content that folklore can provide is, a space through which, they entertain this Trece, okay, or folklore, okay. So I think we have to be careful in terms of looking at folklore historically, and at the same time, how a specific period used and somehow give meaning to folklore.
For my part, I was
Yeah.
so happy that finally elements from Philippine tradition are used in an anime to give a sense of place. I was so happy to see a balleted tree. Balleted tree actually is one of those things that are uncanny because they can be negative or positive depending on the context. Usually Filipinos associate the balleted tree with bad luck, but in this case, it has that other dimension of good luck, which is also an important tradition in the Philippines, Southeast Asia. And I'm glad it's when Alexandra enters the balleted tree that finally she matures and comes out whole.
Thanks for sharing that. Maybe we still have questions. We have room for one or two more questions before we end this panel, or part A of this panel, panel 7.
But I have to say that Trece is beautiful as a work. I mean,
Oh
you
yeah,
know,
of course.
and I think comics is essentially a genre of folklore. So, in the case of Trece, remembering it, what is interesting though is that the folklore of Trece is also associated with, you know, criminal investigation. So, so in that sense, you can see also that I think if we think about, you know, the popularity right now and read it from a more sociological point of view, it, you know, it tells a lot about, you know, how basically on the one hand we're trying to look for, you know, ways and, you know, forms of mystifying what gets to be, you know, turned to be unilateral or, you know, unified by capital. But on the other hand, also it is also like, you know, I mean, going back to the, you know, history, that history has never left us. It continues to hunt us. And, you know, and Trece is the one that, you know, enables that hunting.
Yeah. Well, I think the Philippines, like Latin America, is a magical realist country. Magical realism has never disappeared. It's still around.
And I think Noel is raising her hand. Noel, yes.
Yes, I just want to say that it was reading Father Francisco Alcina's books, you know, his on eastern side of the Visayas, that really, I mean, when I first read his works, he's a Jesuit priest who was based in the eastern Visayas in the 17th century, and it's like this is the same thing that is going on till today. You know, the
Yes.
belief systems, and also for me, I mean, even in Zamboanga, I mean, the things he mentions, and the spirits, and all that. I mean, it was there, you know, even then in the 17th century. And yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to share that for me, because for me it was like, you know, he's speaking of how many centuries ago, and yet it's still alive then, you know, even in Mindanao, in Zamboanga, where I came from growing up. Anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Jomar, you were, yes.
No, I just want to react to Felice's argument, what Felice has shared, because Isabella de los Reyes also wrote about Visayas. So he has a work on that. And I haven't really touched it, but there, you know. So I guess what I'm also saying here is that the relevance of this discussion is also coming from this lineage of work of Isabella de los Reyes, who has, you know, expanded, you know, from Ilocos to Visayas, or perhaps to Mindanao.
And just to give our foreign participants a sort of intro, because maybe some of them are asking, what is this Trece these three guys are talking about? Trece is a Netflix produced, or was it Netflix produced, or it can be seen via Netflix, an animated series based on a work by Budget Tan, an Atenean, by the way, featuring Philippine mythological creatures and references to Filipino folklore. So for those who are maybe wondering what is this Trece the panel is suddenly talking about, it's an animated series. So if you have the time, yeah, please do watch it.
It's actually dubbed in it's in Tagalog, of course. Then
Yes.
it's also in English, Spanish, and Japanese.
Yes. Okay. Can we have one more question? Do we have other questions to end this panel? Because if there are none,
I think there was a comment on YouTube. It's not a question, but we sent it to you.
yeah. A comment on yesterday's sessions on gender magic realism was discussed as it is, or it was a way to fight the patriarchy. So magic realism as a way of fighting patriarchy.
Oh.
Any comments on that insight? Magic realism as a way to combat, how do you call it? Well, nowadays we call it toxic masculinity, or the dominance of men is was magic realism a way to
I guess I
can you
cannot.
see it a way
Frankly
to
speaking, I
fight?
cannot see the connection. Sorry.
Definitely, there are certain passages, for example, in the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where they critique patriarchy, and they reveal, like, stories of prostitutes, stories of, of women, suffering from their love affairs. These are, or in the House of Spirit, like, Isabel Allende, seeing, how the family crumbles. Okay. So definitely there is, it's not really far, but I don't think that magical realism as an entire genre, as a body of writing, are just, targeting that kind of political agenda. Magical realism, after all, is, a very expansive and wealthy, body of literature from the American region. And somehow, the way I appreciate, by saying Philippines is also akin to magical realism of Latin America, it's because also of, I think, more than just simply saying, in the case of Isabella de los Reyes, definitely is critical of patriarchy through the mother, but doesn't mean that, he's a good example of defying patriarchy. After all, he had so many wives. So he's not the best example for that. Okay. But I think, the way to respond to that, point is to think about, patriarchy as one of the fronts through which, these works are actually trying to address, right, trying to be critical of. And in the case of like Leona Florentino, let me just share this, interesting, observation that I got from the book El Folklore Filipino, because Leona Florentino was actually, her poems were exhibited in Paris World's Fair in 1898, and this is something that I've been like trying to find a way to really unpack, because somehow the mother was exhibited in by Angia Wolska, because they were planning to build like a library of women's writing in France. And I checked in the in the the OPAC of the French National Library. That woman that De Los Reyes was referring to, that Polish woman, was actually there. So I was like hoping before the pandemic to go there to Paris to see that work. So, but no, I can't right now. But so in the case of like, so to answer the question, women, right, okay, or the status of a woman is part of, a political concern. Okay. So there.
Thanks for sharing your insights, Jomar, Dr. Shiasita. And that ends our Q&A for part one.
Thank you.
We'll pause here
Thank
for a
you.
brief break before we proceed to part two. We will be back at 5:25. So thank you, Jomar. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Shiasita. Thank you for
Okay, thank you.
watching the first part.
Thank you.
While we're taking a brief break, let's line up the videos that will be presented for the next presentation. Mike will be the one sharing the presentation. That's next, no?
Okay. And that's our brief break. We're back for part two of our panel on difference and identity. Let me begin part two by introducing our speaker, Dr. Regalado Trota Jose. Dr. Regalado Trota Jose studied anthropology and Philippine studies, art history at the University of the Philippines. His research, writings, and advocacy focus on church cultural heritage of the Hispanic Philippines. Presently, he is the archivist of the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. He also teaches at the UST's Cultural Heritage Studies program. His latest book, which came out early this year, is Simbahan, an illustrated guide to 50 of the Philippines' must-visit Catholic churches. I will be playing Dr. Jose's recorded lecture. Let me just share my screen.
Hello, good day to all, and welcome to the conference. I am Regalado Trota Jose, and I am the archivist of the University of Santo Tomas. Allow me to share my screen. This may take a few seconds. Okay. This paper seeks to contribute to the growing number of studies on intercultural relations, focusing on Chinese-Filipino relations in the first half century of Spanish colonization. The paper is based on two manuscripts in the Archivo de la Universidad de Santo Tomas, or AUST, in Manila, one in the Archivo de la Provincia de los Agustinos Filipinos, or APAF, in Valladolid, Spain, and the Spanish-Chinese Dictionary in the AUST, all dating from the 1630s and 1640s. The earliest document is concerned with the Indio or native settlement called Santa Catalina, adjoining the Pariang. At the moment, we cannot find Santa Catalina inscribed on early map of Manila. However, Francisco Gainza's 1847 Memoria mentions the barrio of Santa Catalina as one of the areas comprised by the Pariang, which also included the Sitio de Madereros, or lumberyard, and the Colegio de Letran, before it moved through Intramuros in 1669. It is Letran. Fidel Villaruel notes that Santa Catalina was an islet into the form of a delta, bounded by an estero, which ran near the Dominican convent, and another which separated it from San Miguel. Hence, Santa Catalina is most probably the land directly southeast of the Pariang. San Miguel will be over here. On the second day of January 1636, the Dominican Procurator General, Fray Francisco de Acosta, filed a suit in the office of the Alcalde Mayor of Tondo to have the Indios living in Santa Catalina to leave the land. The place was owned by the 25-year-old Colegio de Santo Tomas, and the institution had other plans for it. The next day, a copy of the suit was read out to the leaders of the Santa Catalina community through the interpreter Sebastian Ombeng. It is Sebastian Ombeng's signature. The leaders declared that they had heard and understood the document, and those who could sign did so. So here we have the names of some of the Santa Catalina inhabitants: Don Agustin Tiwalat and Don Agustin Libot, who signed in by Bayen, and Don Agustin de la Paz, Don Diego de Maano, and Don Luis Domingo de Ramos, who signed in a Spanish way. These five leaders, who identified themselves as Naturales del Pueblo de Santa Catalina, responded to the suit on the 7th of June in a letter also filed in Tondo. This is the letter. The five protested the decree issued by the Alcalde Mayor, by which the Principales and Timawas of Santa Catalina had to abandon their homes in 3 days. They said they had been invited by the Dominicans to settle here some 20 years ago, therefore around 1615, to establish a pueblo similar to those of nearby Dilao and San Miguel. For this, the newcomers left their earlier homes and began to level the land for their new homes. Eventually, they began to pay 2 reales a month as rent. Fray Acosta filed a rejoinder on the 14th of January, which was read out loud to the interpreter Sebastian Ombeng in Santa Catalina 4 days later. Again, the leaders signed that they had heard the notice, but Agustin Libot was absent. Another person signed in Baybayin, Pedro Salingit, although the name was transcribed in the document as Pedro Singit. Here's Pedro Singit. Still another person who received the notice but did not sign was Pedro Noe. We do not see Agustin de la Paz and his neighbors anymore in this archival chain, and this property was donated to the Colegio to the city of Manila 7 months later on 16 August 1636. Here are close-ups of the signatures as they signed in the 3 documents. From this first series of documents, we can imagine that for the first decades of the Parian, there was an adjoining community of Indios. This proximity of 2 cultures was an important factor in the emergence of the Mestizo Sangley. Our second set of documents deals with the complaint of the Sangleyas Cristianos and Mestizo Sangleyas of Binondo and Baybay, addressed to an unknown authority but dated 26 July 1637. These 2 groups bitterly protested their maltreatment under the hands of the Dominican Father Diego Collado and his companions. Padre Collado arrived in Manila in 1635 with a self-appointed mission to form a congregation, separate from that in the Philippines, dedicated solely to evangelization in Japan, China, and Taiwan. Towards this end, he was able to have Governor General Hurtado de Corcuera hand over to his Congregación de San Pablo the Dominican houses of Binondo, Parian, San Gabriel, Cavite, Nueva Segovia in Cagayan, and Todos los Santos in Formosa. The complainants of Binondo and Baybay pointed out that due to the threats and insults hurled against them by the curate of Binondo, the Dominican Gaspar de Carvalho, they were considering relocating to other places. Before and after Sunday Mass, there was always a lot of whippings. One Sunday, the infantry captain Gaspar de Vera was severely beaten in the middle of the church. Another 4 were whipped because they had not attended Mass the other Sunday, and the cedulas they showed to prove otherwise were declared to be fake. Finally, on another Sunday, the public scribe Juan de Argulia Trillon was told by Carvalho, in the presence of Collado, not to enter the church. But he entered the church anyway, and 3 priests followed him and harangued him so greatly that 200 persons and their wives left in order to hear Mass in another church. They were greatly scandalized by the high-handed manner of Collado's congregation, more so that the men they beat up were highly respected members of the community. Those who dared to complain were threatened with double the payment of taxes and other penalties, so much so that they would wish they had not been born. The Dominican provincial, Carlos Clemente Gan, eventually managed to gain the upper hand over Collado and his congregation. Governor Corcuera himself, in an abrupt turnaround, provided armed guards to escort Collado and his converts out of their enclaves and back to Santo Domingo, and to replace them with their legitimate successors. On 6 September 1637, the churches of Parian and Binondo and the Hospital de San Gabriel were retaken by the province of the Holy Rosary. 2 letters of complaint from Binondo and Baybay are bolstered by 2 sheets of signatures. Most are in Chinese characters, Atop many of these, a scribe has added their Romanized equivalents. Here are the Romanized equivalents in the Chinese signatures. We can see several Spanish surnames that are common up to today: Baptista de la Cruz, de la Vega, de Vera, Lopez, as well as Chinese names, Chinese family names: Aiko, Chico, Sison, Tangko, Vico. Crucial for our purposes are the signatures in Baybayin. This is the second document with most of the same signatures. These are the signatures in Baybayin. These signatures have been interpreted by Father Alberto Santamaria as Domingo Dizon, Domingo Gonzalo, Pedro Sasa, Luis Kisi, Juan Kisi, and Juan Engson. In those days, the J was pronounced more like an S. So we have Habon pronounced as Sobon. So that's the relation. This allows us, if the interpretation is correct, as seems likely, then we have examples of Chinese family names written in Baybayin. This allows us to imagine that these signatories were children of Chinese fathers and Filipino mothers who taught them how to write and sign in Baybayin. They were the third or second generation of mestizos Sangleyas who still knew how to write in Baybayin. Incidentally, the 1637 letter was written in Isla de Paquiao, or Paquiao, which does not appear in any known map or in any of the texts reviewed so far. It may have been a small island between Binondo and Baybay, as suggested in a 1753 map in the Archivo General de Indias. This area seems to be undeveloped. However, in the AUSD's Dictionario Hispanico-Sinico, which we shall discuss shortly, the Hokkien word pagyake corresponds to azotar por las calles, or to whip in the streets. Could this have been a sarcastic name for the island of Binondo? The preceding Binondo Baybay complaint of 1637 is a good indication that the Chinese Christian community with their families were not limited only to Binondo. They also had residences in Baybay, which was just separated from Binondo by what was then called the Rio de Tondo, but eventually became known as the Estero de Binondo. In fact, according to early Dominican sources, Baybay was the first settlement of Chinese in the Manila area, even before the arrival of the Spaniards. The place was then known as Lungos, an extension of land for the governor's house in Tondo to the Pasig River. Here is the Pasig River. It was bounded on its length by the Rio de Tondo and Manila Bay. Lacandula gave this land to the Chinese and the families to settle in. With industry, they reclaimed more land from the sea, and the area became known as Baybay. This change of name is instructional. Longos is the Tagalog word for promontory, while Baybay means shore. Thanks to a file dated 1683 in the Archivo de los Agustinos Filipinos in Valladolid, Spain, we have a better understanding of Baybay during the first half of the 17th century. The file picks up the story after the 1639 Chinese rebellion, during which the Parian was burned. Governor Corcuera rebuilt the Parian in Baybay, displacing the inhabitants who claimed they had been here for the past 50 years, meaning they were here since about 1580s. The governor's successor, Diego Fajardo, returned the Parian to its old site across the river soon after its arrival in Manila in 1644. In mid-1645, the mestizos of Sangley and the Sangreas Cristianos appealed to Fajardo to let them return to their old homes. After a series of hearings, the original residents were awarded back their land on 3 February 1646. The downside of this was the ejection of Españoles, Sangreas Chinchoros, Negros, y Otros, who had moved here in the meantime. One of the leaders of the Baybay petitioners was Sargento Mayor Gabriel de la Anunciacion, a Mrs. Sangley, who also signed in the 1637 complaint presented earlier. We find him as well in another document dated 13 December 1634, where he bought 11 pieces of land in Tondo from Doña Francisca Luangan, which all these lands were then acquired by UST, which is why the documents are in the archives. With a little more time, we should be able to relate these personalities across documents and give more flesh to actual people who lived during these times. The 1683 dossier also includes a copy of a map originally drawn in 1602, showing the division of Baybay into Sangreas Cristianos and Sangreas Infieles. This is a section for the Chinese Christians and the pagan Chinese. A church also appears, made of stone and roofed with tile, Iglesia de Baybay. With this structure, it is possible to correlate certain landmarks in the Ignacio Muñoz map of 1671 and the map painted on the inner side of a chest, which is kept in the Museo Bello in Puebla, Mexico. The map is dated 1671, but we know it was made about 1669 before Muñoz left for Spain. So there's this is the map of the chest, and we have inverted it to match the Muñoz map. And so there's a church here, which is that of Longos or Baybay, the Church of Binondo, the Church of the Hospital de San Gabriel, and the enclave of the Parian. We now have some data which show that Baybay was a significant and busy district whose citizens' lives were intertwined with those of Binondo. The AUST has a Diccionario Hispanico-Sinicum, a Spanish-Chinese dictionary that is extraordinary. Within its 1,103 pages and 27,000 words are 4 columns: the Spanish head words, the Chinese characters for their equivalents, the pronunciation in Hokkien, and the pronunciation in Mandarin. This dictionario can be dated through an entry referring to the Spanish in Formosa in the present tense. Tierra de Isla Hermosa, adonde están los españoles. Land of Hermosa Island, where the Spaniards are. This places it between 1626, when the Spaniards established a base in northern Taiwan, and 1642, when they were expelled from the island by the Dutch. So these are the routes of the Dominicans. They would pass by Hug Island, where they built a huge church, which is still standing, and from here proceed to northern Taiwan, and then from here proceed to mainland China. So they are just excavating the ruins of the church built by the Dominicans in Chilong, in northern Taiwan. A likely candidate for the authorship of the Diccionario Hispanico-Sinicum is the Dominican Father Alberto Collares, who ministered to the Manila Chinese in the Parian, Binondo, and San Gabriel for most of his apostolate in the Philippines. Dominican bibliographers credit him with preparing a copious Diccionario Cínico-Español. It is said that Father Collares was conversant in both Chinese and Tagalog. Thus, a point in his favor is the number of Tagalog entries among the Spanish words, with the Chinese counterparts included in this dictionary. Here we present the words. To show the Tagalog sources, we have included the sources in how they are mentioned in the early 17th century dictionaries. Arige, or house post, is mentioned 3 times. Bahag, the G string. Bunga and buyo, which are elements in the chewing of betel nut. Kaban, which is a case or a chest. Kamangyan, which is incense. Carabao, which is the water buffalo. And as William Henry Scott has noted, Carabao was a Malay loan word, which replaced the native word anwang. Kate is the ebbing of the tide. Galagala is a material used to waterproof ships and boats. Dinugaw comes from the root word lugaw, or rice porridge. Mabolo is the fruit of the kamagong tree, and nangka is the jackfruit. Palapala is a framework, and Parian is the marketplace, which gave the its name to the famous region, the famous district, market district outside Intramuros. Payo is our payong or umbrella. Paypay is a fan. Saya is a skirt. Saya is a kind of silken cloth. Tambobo or tabobong now is a granary or a storehouse. Talakito is now our present-day talakitok, a fish. Kangingi is also a fish. And the last word is bilanggo, which at that time was a sheriff. And ironically today, bilanggo means a prisoner. We leave for a much later study the presence of these words in the dictionary. We will need more data and analysis for the social cultural analysis of these words. However, it must be pointed out that Tagalog words have also been found in a recently published book, Philippine Chinese Materials in the Herzog August Library, which is in Wolfenbüttel in Lower Saxony, Germany. The book is just is still in transit, and so we would like to see what Tagalog words were included here. All this evidence strongly suggests a thriving Sangli, Indio, and Mestizo Sangli community, not quite barred by ethnic boundaries as we usually imagine them. Unfortunately, the rebellion of Chinese in Colamba led to the massacre of 20,000 Sanglias in 1639. Such a crisis and the maltreatments and the petition and the return of the land in 1646 undoubtedly led to the bonding of the Chinese Christians and their offspring, the Mestizos de Sangli. I'd like to end. The Baybayin signatures, here. These are the Chinese districts of Binondo, Baybay, and the Parian. And then the Jesuits also opened a district for the Chinese in Santa Cruz. The Baybayin signatures of Chinese sounding names and the Tagalog words in a Spanish-Chinese dictionary give us an unparalleled witnessing of the growth of the Mestizo Sangli communities. The close proximity of Sangli in indigenous communities and the crisis that confronted both Sanglias Cristianos and Mestizo Sanglias only helped to bond the two groups together, inevitably leading to the crucial niche of the Mestizo Sangli in Filipino society. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much for your attention, and please enjoy the rest of this conference. Thank you.
Okay, that was the recorded presentation of Dr. Jose. And with that, we now turn to the next speaker, Mr. Mark Dizon. Mark Dizon is assistant professor in the Department of History at the Ateneo de Manila University. His interests are in the cross-cultural encounters of the early modern world. His current research project is on the mobilities in an 18th century Philippine borderland. So, Mark, you may now Mark?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
I just prepared the slide. So for today, I'll be talking about the integration of the Merdeka and Guachinango soldiers in Philippine society. And usually when we think about warfare, we tend to think of violence, obviously, and conflict. So it's not usually the sort of themes that we associate with the conference, with contacts and continuities. When we think of warfare, we think of disruption and violence. It's not what you would expect from sort of cross-cultural encounters. There's usually a sharp binary between peaceful contacts and violent wars. Although I think for today's presentation, I'll encourage people to think of warfare as also a form of exchange. Exchange is not limited to the economic, social, and political, but the military and sort of violent aspect for it is also a part of it. So it's a more complex interpretation of contacts and counters where warfare is also involved. And you can see this in the two examples that I'll be citing of the Asian and Hispanic soldiers, the first from the Moluccas and the other from Mexico, that these soldiers from Mexico and from the Moluccas were actually agents of cultural and political changes as well, despite the presence of violence. So just to give you a definition of who these people are, usually as far as I'm concerned, when we use the Merdeka, at least in the literature during that time, they usually use the term Merdeka to refer to the people from the Moluccas, from Ternate and Tidore, and usually in the case of the Philippines, they were usually the mercenaries and the allies of the Spaniards at that time. On the other hand, the Guachinangos, they were the Spanish convicts that were recruited, quote unquote, from Mexico, but in reality, they were coerced, they were basically tried and convicted, and they were being forced to serve their punishment in the Philippines as soldiers. So if you look at the Merdekas and the Guachinangos, the Moluccans, soldiers, and the Guachinango, the Spanish convicts, they were actually involved in the conquest in the Philippines, and yet at the same time, they were crucial and they were also integrated into Philippine societies. So what you have here is, I would say, is a more complex, nuanced picture where certain segments, they were able to integrate themselves into certain segments of Philippine society, despite sort of the violent origins or nature of the original sort of reason why they're actually in the Philippines. And to a certain extent, it makes sense. If you look at a lot of the military forces during that time, the early modern period, a lot of them were multi-ethnic, nations did not exist. And in these multi-ethnic forces, a lot of people from different groups were actually fighting together with one another. So to a certain extent, this sort of cross-cultural encounters that we will see later on, it's not surprising if you look at the composition of a lot of these military forces in the early modern period. A large part of the Merdekas came from the Moluccas. They came from the Moluccas, and most of you probably already know there was a competition for spices, and a lot of it is in the Moluccas. And then the Spaniards had interest in it, so they sort of allied to certain groups in Ternate and Tidore. They built forts there. But in 1662, there was a threat from Posinga, the Spanish pirate. There was a threat that he was going to attack Manila. So eventually, 1662, there was an order from the Governor General of the Philippines to abandon all of the forts, including the ones in Ternate and Tidore, and to focus on Manila because they wanted to defend the Spanish capital, Manila, from Chinese attack. But of course, the Chinese attack never happened. But what happened was a lot of these soldiers were allied with the Spaniards who came from Moluccas, They never went back to Moluccas. They stayed in the Philippines, and some of them were actually part of the royalty there. And I think the most famous example is Francisco Javier Cachilduco. He was the maestre de campo of the Merdicas, so he was shipped, and all of the other Merdicas were shipped to the Philippines to defend it from supposed Chinese invasion. And then Cachilduco was a prince of Tidore, and even when he was in the Philippines, he continued to be the allies of Spain. So whether he was in the Moluccas or in the Philippines, he was still he performed sort of this military ally of the Hispanic monarchy. And Cachilduco, that's why his name Francisco Javier, because in 1664 he was baptized by the Archbishop of Manila, and he continued in this role as a part of the Spanish conquest. He served in the Spanish infantry. He also participated in the conquest of the Igorots and the Zambales. And whenever there were piratical attacks on the coast of northern Luzon, he was also part of the naval defense of the coast. And in one occasion, a galleon ship was needed defending, and it was part of the Spanish Armada that actually that escorted this particular galleon ship that they needed to defend. And as sort of recognition for his military service to the Hispanic monarchy, he applied for an encomienda in Cagayan for his services, and as far as we know, he was actually granted an encomienda in Cagayan. So this is once you can clearly see that that somebody from the Moluccas was able to settle into the Philippines through his military service. And that's not where this stops. If you look at Cachilduco's descendants, his son Miguel had an encomienda in Vigan. I think they inherited the encomienda of their father, and also they also were able to expand it as well. Cachilduco's daughter Josefa married a Spanish military officer, Felipe Vallejo. And again, to a certain extent, this is very consistent to the multi-ethnic character of military forces at that time. And you can look at this, as a marriage between part of the military elite. And as far as we know, their children, the children of Josefa and Felipe Vallejo, they inherited the encomiendas and estates in Ilocos as well. So they were actually settled in Ilocos and Cagayan. I'm not too sure of the connection with Maximo Vallejo Duco. I don't know if they're related to Cachilduco, but based solely on the name Vallejo Duco, most probably an offspring or related to Josefa and Felipe Vallejo. And if you look at by the 18th century, he occupied the position at various times in the 18th century. He was a chief constable, and at one time he was also the provincial governor in Ilocos. So if you look at these are familiar strategies to a certain extent. We should not be surprised by this. This is how people consolidated their status. In cross-cultural instances, you had alliances and exchanges, and partly you did this through the institution of marriage. You have Josefa Cachilduco at Tidore's royalty marrying a Spanish captain, Felipe Vallejo. So this was how the Cachilducos were actually able to maintain their social and political position, even when they migrated from the Moluccas to the Philippines. To a certain extent, they were still rulers. They were very, very adaptable and able to do this. And again, the starting point for all of this was actually warfare. This was the family strategy to acquire and maintain their social and political status. Let's move on to the other group, the Guachinangos. These are the Spanish soldiers from Mexico. And to a certain extent, the Guachinangos provide a different argument to this, because usually when we look at the Merdicas, at least in the case of the Cachilducos, they were part of the Moluccan royalty. But on the other hand, the Guachitangos are completely different. They're from the lower classes. We have a less rosy picture. They're not part of the elite. Guachinango is actually it's of Nahuatl origin. If you look at the word, it's from Nahuatl. And it's usually the term used in the Philippines to refer to the Spanish soldiers from Mexico. It was a popular term used in the Philippines at that time, but also it was very derogatory because there was some segments in Philippine side didn't particularly like the Guachinangos. And why were there Spanish soldiers being recruited from Mexico? Because there were hardly any soldiers in the Philippines. So they had to forcibly recruit people from Mexico. Why? Because they believed that Spanish soldiers were much more loyal than indigenous soldiers from the Philippines. So basically, it was a form of military impressment. So the galleon ships yearly have these galleon ships coming from Acapulco to connected to Manila. And by law, Mexico had to supply Manila with a certain amount of soldiers also, although they were not able to do this each and every single time. But on average, I think somebody has already studied this. On average, I think in the 17th century, there were about 156 soldiers, these Spanish convict soldiers coming to the Philippines in the 17th century. Because the reality was there was no, the Philippines was very, very far away from Latin America, from Spain. So nobody actually wanted to go there. So since nobody wanted to sort of man the forts in the Philippines, they had to force people and round up Spanish deserters, criminals, and vagabonds to actually man a lot of the forts in the Philippines at that time. And this is partly the reason why they had this very bad reputation in the Philippines, because they were not actually the the best examples of Spanish society at that time. And so if you look at their background, most of them were convicted criminals. That's why they were sent to the Philippines. They were pickpocket, rustlers, highwaymen, undesirables. They were drunk, lazy, unemployed. Usually they were addicted to vices, and usually they either brought disrepute to their family. In some cases, their families would report them to authorities because they were lazy, they were involved in vices and crime. And then as punishment, they would be shipped to the Philippines. So if you look at the social background of these people, they were actually lower class Spaniards. To a certain extent, they were the dregs of Mexican society. And it worked from the perspective of the Spanish government, because they were actually hitting two birds with one stone. They were solving two problems. One was you have this, at least especially in the 18th century, there was this growing sense of criminality in Mexico. So how do you solve this? Well, you round up all of these criminals, you convict them, and you send them as punishment to serve in the forts in the Philippines. And it solves the problem in the Philippines that you don't have enough Spanish soldiers there, because, again, they thought that Spanish soldiers would be better than the indigenous soldiers because they were much more loyal. So usually the standard story of the Guachinangos that you will find in the literature, and I think there are several books written about these convict soldiers already. Usually the story that you get is this story of despair. The conditions in the Philippine forts were horrendous. It was very, very harsh. And this is the reason why it's a form of punishment. It was a far off destination on the other side of the world. They had to do hard physical labor in some of the different forts. They had to do sort of part of the royal fundry. There was not enough supplies in the forts as well. So the living conditions in the forts were unhealthy. They were also prone to attacks from the Muslim sultanates, from European rivals, or from indigenous rebels from the Philippines itself. Usually this was a form of military impressment. It was a punishment for these people convicted in Mexico. And usually the term that they had to serve based on the trial based on the sentence was 8 years. But the reality was they usually never returned home. So they were actually forced to live in the Philippines. And usually if you look at the standard sources that you have, they usually present a very bleak picture. So you have these sort of convicts from Mexico, and usually they're just moving from one place to another. They were deviants in Mexico, and they were still deviants in the Philippines to a certain extent, because of this reputation that they have. And sort of there's this sort of that's why they were called Huachinangos, because it was a very derogatory term against them. And one of the common stories that, because the conditions in the forts were horrible, they were forced to stay in the Philippines forever. The common story that goes around is that a lot of them eventually just tried to escape from the forts at the end of the 8 years, or even during the 8 years, some of them would actually try to escape. And the theory goes, it's undocumented, but a lot of the contemporary sources at that time would say that a lot of them would actually integrate themselves in the Philippine countryside, would live with Indio fugitives outside of Spanish colonial control. But again, we don't have a lot of proof of this, because again, they're outside of Spanish control. They're not in the ports anymore. But at least that's one of the theories, that eventually they married. They were hanging out with the Indio fugitives in the Philippine countryside. On the other hand, I was looking at some of the forts in Luzon, and I found out that some of them were actually Spanish soldiers. For most probably, some of them were also Spanish convicts from Mexico. They were also Guachinangos. And if you look at in some cases, maybe their story was not so bleak as well. Because I think one of the problems when you think of forts, think of their original intention as military outposts. But in reality, a lot of these forts were also commercial outposts. That a lot of these soldiers had roles beyond the strictly military. And I think this is one of the neglected role of forts in some cases. Like for example, at least in the case of the provinces, the provincial governor usually was involved in trade, and usually he was in charge of the different forts. And it seems like he was using the forts as part of his trading network here. So of course, we already know that the provincial governor, the Spanish provincial governors were not allowed to trade because of conflict of interest. But the reality was the provincial governor, the only way that he's going to make money if he actually trades at the provincial level. So at least in the case of certain hinterland provinces, like for example, Ilocos or Cagayan, a lot of them were actually trading with indigenous communities like the Kalingas, and they were trying to acquire wax, animal meat, and other things. And what happened was these provincial governors in Ilocos and Cagayan, they were using these frontier forts that were under their control to actually extend their trading into the hinterland to gain a lot of these forest products. So what happened was a lot of these Spanish soldiers who were serving the forts were actually part of this trading network, this patronage network set up by the provincial governors and the provinces. So they were actually sort of like the agents of the provincial governors in the hinterland, trading with Kalingas and other indigenous groups in the interior of, for example, Luzon. And to a certain extent, we shouldn't be surprised by this. This is how the Hispanic monarchy worked. It worked through patronage networks. So a lot of these Guachinangos, when they were serving in these frontier forts, they actually integrated themselves into these patronage networks. And in some cases, they also said that the soldiers were serving these forts. They acted like petty governors. Some of the colonized Indios were actually complaining like these lowly Spanish soldiers were actually acting like they were the petty governors and ordering people around while they were trading. So if you look at the situation, I think it is one way of how the Guachinangos probably integrated themselves into Philippine society. They were part of this illegal trading, the countryside, trading with independent communities, and actually using the colonized towns to actually serve as labor in the illegal trade that they were actually carrying out in the hinterland. So if you look at the Merdicas and Guachinangos, they have these very different backgrounds. But at the same one was, at least in the case of Cachalduco, he was part of the Tidorese royalty. On the other hand, the Guachinangos were criminals from Mexico. But at the end of the day, they had a similar trajectory. They participated in part of the conquest in the Philippines. But at the same time, it was their military load that led to their integration into Philippine society. That you can see that it's very difficult to disentangle the military conquest from political, social, and economic factors. The Merdica were become encomenderos and alcalde mayores in Ilocos and Cagayan, and the Guachinangos would become sort of like petty governors in the forts. So, and to a certain extent, it's the patronage networks and king groups that were common in colonial and indigenous societies that provided the opportunity for these outsiders to actually integrate themselves into Philippine society. And there's a high likelihood that, for example, Cachalduco's descendants were the provincial governors of Iloilo and Cagayan. And it's highly likely that Guachinangos were actually serving under the descendants of Cachalducos in the forts in Ilocos and Cagayan as well. So it's one way to rethink of warfare as also a point of contact and exchange.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And with that, we now move on to our last speaker for this panel. Joining us all the way from Madrid is Professor Florentino Rodao. Florentino Rodao obtained a PhD at Tokyo and Complutense Universities. He is the author of Franco's Spain and the Japanese Empire, published in 2002, and Francoists Without Franco, the Spanish Civil War in the Philippines, published in 2012. So, Dr. Rodao, I think you're ready with your presentation.
Hi, how are you? I hope it is being right now. It's okay right now?
Yes, so we can see your presentation.
So you
Can
can
you
see the presentation.
Just click on the slideshow button.
Yeah. Okay.
There. Thank you.
Now it's okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you very much to all of you. I'm very pleased to participate. Thank you very much to all the conveners and the people who participate, and especially to Feliz Noel who invited me. Okay, so I'm going to be very brief, and I just want to comment something that this part of race, which I'm really, is not my area of expertise, and I'm not working right now on it. But then anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about this, you know, these discourses on the difference in the Philippines, on related to the Spanish Empire, whatever, you know. Okay, what can we say about the mention of the bodies, you know, these discourses? Of course, we can mention cultural questions and the like, you know, but well, the question of race is also changing like chameleon, obviously, you know, from the very beginning, you can see that this from the medieval ages, when they portrayed Saint Judas accompanied by dark people who is doing bad versus the white people or the clearer people who is the good people. Well, the description is usually the image of the somatic difference and the like. And the biggest problem is the question of the blood, which is in some kind can mean the purity, whatever. Also, we mentioned the question of the castes, the mixing, which is obviously is a question of mixing social status, a kind of the blood, and also, well, the breeding, you know, the physical traits, the inherited temperaments. Okay, so with all this kind of discourses, the only common thing that we can find in every discourses is the continuity, the exclusion of some people. Okay, so let us start, you know, because the question of the race is also in a Spanish word, you know, raza. When we can find the first in the first Spanish dictionary of the Spanish language, you know, the main person thinking about this is Antonio de Nebrija. You know, in fact, when it was the year 1492, the year that Spain, Columbus, discovered America, it was in the year 1492. It was the same year that also the Spaniards or the Catholic kings expelled the Bangsamoros, the Moors from Granada. This same year, it was when Antonio de Nebrija published his first grammar of Spanish language, and he says very clear, we needed, this is for empire, you know, we need to unify the language, all these kind of things, you know. So Antonio de Nebrija is really quite an important person for the Spanish language, also for the Spanish history. And then in this dictionary, you can see here raza, the question of raza. You can see there are two definitions to raza. You can see that here, excuse me, here, you know, raza. There were two meanings. One of them, it was the sun ray, el rayo del sol, la raza del sol, isn't it? You can see radius solis per riba. Anyway, but the another meaning of the word raza, it was the raza del paño. I mean, the bad, so to say, the bad garment. When a garment allowed the sun rays to trespass the garment and going into the skin, you know. So it was something like a jargon of the tailors that in some kind passed to the political usage, you know. Well, so, you know, you can see that after that, you know, look here, I just selected this phrase, you know. Se propuso un estatuto por nos, arzobispo de Toledo, en esta Santa Iglesia, en el cual se contenía desde aquel día en adelante todos los beneficiados de aquella Santa Iglesia a dignidades como canónigos, racioneros, capellanes y clerizones fuesen cristianos viejos sin raza de judío, ni de moro, ni herejes. So in that sense, we can see clearly that the meaning of raza, it means also, in this case, also to trespass the trace. So we can see the meaning of race has changed into something like the trace of you. So they must be all Christians without trace of you, Muslims, or heretics. So we can see that the meaning of race, as many other cases, it changes the meaning because Spain in some kind has a kind of national formation. In 1492 started something like the making of the Spanish nation. That means something like about 100 years. The Jews and the Muslims were expelled first, but also the people who remained. After some years, they were forbidden to have their own food. Later, they were forbidden to have the hijab, the chilabas, whatever. And after that, they were forbidden to have their own sayings, whatever, So after something like the last something like national formation decree, it was in 1609. So finally, in 100 years, Spain became something like a unified people. Let us say this way, Well, in this formation of the new country, so to say, early formation, but at the same time as English or French, all the nation started in early 19th century. Anyway, the main word in here, it was the stain, the macula, the word macula, You can see the translation in Spanish right now, the mark that dirties the body, a thing that the lusters and tarnishes the body, So, this is a clear step forward between the former meaning of race, in the sense that for the first time we think, or in Spain it was thought that just a person, just by being born, just has a kind of something like can be expelled, Before, well, it was not, did not start at this time, For in medieval Spain, for instance, women, Jew, could not breast, could not fed with the breast to Christian boys, in the sense that they could transmit through the milk, they could transmit something like the impurities, the macula, the stain, So, well, but anyway, in the question of the national formation of Spain, it was the Cristianos Viejos, so it was divided, something like the people that their blood was poor and clean, and the new Christians, I mean the people that was forcefully, or they became being Muslim, but then later they became Christians or Jews, whatever, it was one of the ways to say that they could, you have to not trust them, So the Cristianos Nuevos, the new Christians, they were said as blood impure. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is widely known, So the blood purity, it was quite important for the for the statutes, for the people who wanted to become something like higher ranks of the society. So this, just to enter into any of the most important societies in Spain, you have to declare that you have to show your statute of white poor blood, poor blood, isn't it? Well, of course, well, the Inquisition is quite well known to be an enemy of the Christians. They declare also that just 1/8 of just being 1/8, something like one of your great grandfathers, if one of them, one of the 8 was Muslim or real, you could not trust. We cannot trust you. Okay, so well, this is well known. The question is, to me, is quite difficult to say. It was proto-racist in this case. Well, father of the former president of foreign prime minister of Israel, Netanyahu, his father was a conservative historian, and he said that the chamber gases of the Nazis started with this proto-racism or this concept of the Spanish race. Well, this is quite difficult to discuss, but anyway, we can say that it was both spiritual and also biological facets. Okay, what we can say about the race, I think, to me, is quite important. How the discourses of the difference, we can discriminate. We can say, look, and this is from the late 16th century to me, this is quite important to compare. Well, this is the frontispiece of the one of the first maps of the world by Ortelius in 1580, that more or less started to draw the world as it was. You can see in these discourses of the difference, you can see, well, here is Latin America, they are killing each other, so it's better to save them killing more people. Anyway, well, this is the representation of Africa and Asia, and well, among the representation of Europe, which is here, is in more elevated, we can see also the world, you know, the first. We have been the first. We have been the Westerners. We are the ones who know that the world is round shaped, you know. And to me, this is quite important. Also, is when the Christians, when they wanted to civilize or to Christianize, whatever, you know, East Asia. This is this map is you can find not only where Matteo Ricci. This was the man that tried to adapt to Chinese culture in something like as a better way to Christianize them and the like, you know. So you can see the image of the pilgrim, but also here you can see clearly that again this idea of we have a better knowledge than you. Okay, this is nothing new to say, but let us change. Let us move to how it works in Latin America. You know, well, it's nothing special here in the sense that, well, we can see clearly that there are many ways of mestizaje. Here is one of the representations. If you can in Spain to the Museum of Americas, still you can see that how they depicted the many mestizajes, many ways of meaning. Okay, so here is how they depicted the mulatto, a black man with a white Spanish woman having a mulatto. Okay, well, there are many of them. This is the question, of course. In East Asia, we know that very well. When on the Dutch East Indies, there was this is Anne Stoller. He mentions very much about that. You know how the authorities in Dutch East Indies in Batavia, well, they worried very much about the definition of the Europeans, how they feared the interactional fornications, same as it happened in Virginia, for instance, in a famous law in 1662. And well, you know, they found that the mistresses as a breach of with locals. So well, you don't care very much about the problem of these mistresses, these mestizos, and so they became part of the local society, not of the conquerors. Okay, well, in the case of the Portuguese, it's quite different, very similar to Spanish people. We can see many mestizos. The Moreno, I think, is from in India. Merdica, Japanese is also mestizo with the Japan, and you know. The only interesting case with the Portuguese in Portugal, it was in Portuguese in Asia, it was the Marranos, a kind of Jews converts in Mexico, and then they made a lobby, so to say, in Southeast Asia, because they trust personal, familiar networks and the like, you know. So, well, but they were really very much repressed after 1640 about the defeat of Spain, or after when they were in some kind criticized or repressed, not for being only Portuguese, but also for being crypto Jews. Okay, so excuse me. So what happened in the Philippines? To me, Fernando Salcita has been saying very clearly, you know, the meaning of mestizo is very different to that of Latin America. And mestizo in the Philippines, mestizo means with a white person, which was not as in Latin America. So we can say, I think, it is nothing new. I can say in the Philippines there were not the usual Spanish mestizos. You know? To me, what is more important is this: in this representation of the Philippines, there is no trace of the Spanish community. We can see the famous picture with San Agustin. We can see on one side the armies led by Queen Philip II. On the other side, San Agustin is guiding missionaries. But we cannot find the people who live there, you know. Anyway, we can see also this representation of the Spanish Empire, but we can see also the trace of the galleon de Manila, galleon of the Manila Galleon, the Acapulco now, whatever, you know. So, and recently, well, Antonio Garcia Basole, for instance, has been studying about something like the way to become this Spanish mestizo, not, of course, the Chinese one. No? He mentions that he has found some orphans with Spanish education. Some of them got it in the army. Some of those who got in the priesthood, they could become, some of them, they could become something like part of the Spanish mestizo. And there are also some research recently that has been published. For instance, you know, there was the Marquis de Cañete. It was the only Grande de España, I mean, the highest rank among the nobility, who was Spanish, and then he was sent to the Philippines. So before returning from the Philippines, he recognized two kids just born. He recognized two kids, of course, born with a Filipino woman. You know? But then, you know, the Spanish king asked them to be sent back to Spain, you know, and then even, well, they made really efforts, something like paying them money, whatever, but it was in the year in the beginnings of the 19th century. So they suffered something like the consequences of the Trafalgar battle, whatever. So finally, one of their descendants died in Uruguay in 1811. The another one we didn't know very well, you know, we didn't know. He was also in Uruguay, but we don't know about the future. It was published recently, also has been published, well, it's better known, you know, let me see, Queen Mariana de Austria in 17th century, she was the valid, you know, the valid, it was something like the prime minister of the queen, you know, the valid for some time for Queen Mariana de Austria when she was a regent. He was sent to as a punishment. He was fined, and he was for 10 years in the Philippines in prison. While being in prison, he fathered the boy. And he died something like 10 years after that in Mexico. And we can see also from his heredity that a Filipino boy inherited something like 1,000 pesos, a lot of money from him, you know. So, well, we know about that, but really it was difficult. Okay, so let me change to what I think I can say something 19th century. Of course, here we can say the science, the different, before it was something like knowledge, we can say that a science at this time, it's modern science. 19th century, Osterhammel says, it's a language of civilization, and civilization becomes dominant. The university takes part. We start, of course, it's not obviously from 19th century. In 18th century, Linneo, who for the first time, he mentions in this taxonomy, he divides people, the branch of a science that encompasses the description, identification, nomenclature, and classification of organisms. Later we can say also, here is a famous photograph of Blumenbach when he did his PhD dissertation in late 18th century. He traveled to the Caucasus. He liked it very much, the people from the Caucasus. That's why we are called the Caucasian race. And then, well, he says about racial unity. Okay, well, but also it's not only that, it's what Peggy Pascoe mentions about the racialization, you know, the extension of racial meaning to the previously racially unclassified relationships. Well, you know, to me, the most important here is right now, while before it was judged, it was allowed, it was more able to trespass, you know. And for instance, in the case of the Spanish Empire, they could buy the name of Don, just in something like paying for that. The Spanish administration needed money, so a person with money could ascend in the category, you know. But right now is let us say the science, the university who demarcates the race, you know, and also gives the legitimacy to rule over people born inferior. Okay, so let us go in the case of Spain, you know. To me, the most important is in the search of the new discourse, you know. The religious discourse is already getting old, so then they have to find, or we have to find that. Well, you know, in 1810s is the Latin American independences. There are changes, of course, in the empire, not only in Spain, but many other the power of the metropolis is much bigger in 19th century. And in Spain, one of the characteristics has been studied, something like the micro-military expeditions, in the sense that, well, something like Spain made some expeditions, something like more for prestige than for taking new territories, in the sense that Spain knew that it was weak enough, something like not to try many expenditures, you know. Okay, so Spain changes, of course, in 1842, the blood purity statutes disappear, and of course, all these kind of statutes of blood purity had already weakened very much along the 3 centuries. But now, to me, the most important in that sense is that science, the concept of science, this concept of race is everything taken from outside, you know. And Spain, in some kind, is, let me say, that is always in every new idea of race, in every new discourses of the difference, always the Spaniards feel that they are pointed as the worst people. You know, in 18th century, for instance, you know, it was the climate that determined the races of the people. So Spain has the worst climate, the highest temperatures, of course, were pointed as the reason that they were underdeveloped. You know, 19th century, let me say that early 19th century, the mixture of races is when it was claimed. You know, the book by Marquis. So Spain is not to be trusted. Spain had 700 years of being occupied by Arab people, so Spaniards are considered as not to be trusted, as mixed people, you know. And at this time, it was when it was told that the mestizos acquires the word from the imperial races. 1885, it was after Darwinism, it came the social Darwinism. Then later, all these kind of ideas, they always say that the Spaniards pointed to them as not good people, not to be trusted. Well, what happened about that in Latin America, which I think we have to compare with also with the Philippines, you know? This idea of the mestizos for us people to be suspected, you know, is very clear in the case of Cuba, on Puerto Rico probably, but I haven't seen any reference in the case of the Philippines as blaming them for losing the American colonies, so we cannot trust them, you know. I haven't seen that, probably in Latin America, you know. Of course, there is a stricter separation because Creoles and mestizos. In the case of Puerto Rico, you know, the evolution is different in the sense that, for instance, the church backs the interracial weddings of couples, you know. Puerto Rico, something like evolves better. And to me, what is quite different, you know, here in the upper part, the Jíbaro, you know, the Highlands peasant is something like the Creoles assume the discourse of the, and they are proud of the Jíbaro, of this group. In the case of Cuba, it's different. Cuba has big haciendas. It was, you know, it was said that the Cuba deserves an empire, you know. So many profits were taken from Cuba because of the big haciendas, the sugar. So Spain needed that. So they had to look for carrying the production, you know. So what we can see then, well, the ways that it was seen that they adapting to the new discourses, it was something like looking on maintaining the profits from the sugar haciendas, you know. So, well, one of them, for instance, what we can say, the only policy of Spain in East Asia along the 19th century, it was the need for coolie workers, you know. First, for instance, Spain had the Spanish consulate in Macau until 1868, I mean, very, very late, because it was the only place that the sending of coolies were allowed from the China coast into Cuba, you know. So, well, in Cuba also, it was something like the whole idea that white race will educate black race, people inferior, but intellectually born to capable to work in sugar. Okay, so white people should guide black people. But anyway, you know, this discourse on race, it was important already. You know, for instance, I like this something like very rightist party, the Spanish party. Well, it was the ideas of Darwin, it was important. So, well, for instance, you can see very clearly, all for evolution, not one for revolution, you know. So the ideas were into the political life. And to me, the most interesting difficulty or difference between Puerto Rico and Cuba, it was something like, while in Puerto Rico, the Creoles defended the Jíbaro, the Creoles in Cuba did not defend the Guajiros, which it was the same as in Cuba. Well, to me, we can talk about Mexico. The most interesting about Argentina to me is that, well, you know, Argentina, it was the northern part of Argentina. It was, well, the only place where there were people original. There were killing of people, but also here there was the idea of whitening the people. So at this time, it was while the males among the Aboriginals, the males were considered the worst, very sexual people. But then it was the whitening through the women of them, you know? So in some kind, it was this family separation. So you can see something like any country had to adapt to these new ideas of race in a different way, you know? So let me say in the case of the Philippines, Southeast Asia, well, there was one idea of the Eurasian super race, you know? In the case of Dutch Indies, it was the Betawi, something like belonging in a new process of realization from the people immigrated to the rest, to Batavia from the rest of the archipelago. To me, the ideas, what says Alatas, you know, about the meaning of the Malay idleness, to me, it's not very much different from the ones before, you know, the idleness of the Malays, treachery, all this kind of things. Well, to me, is not of a big difference with the rest, you know. We can say also, well, you know, to me, probably the most interesting in that sense is the need to make a separation with the Chinese, you know. But anyway, but to me, probably the most important is the meaning of the degenerate, you know, in the sense as the degenerate, because it's focused on the white and poor people. So it was, and I think Anne Stoller mentions about that also, you know, something like that. We have to take these people out from Dutch Indies because they give bad image to our people. Okay, so let us go to the question of the Philippines. You know, to me, this is the difference. You know, in the difference with the Philippines at this time, it was that since there was let's say almost no Creoles, there was almost no Mestizo. Well, there were Mestizos, but something like, you know, it was. Let me tell you that these ideas of the race, all these kind of things on the social Darwinism, all these kind of things, they coincided with the second phase, with the second step of migration. You know, while in the early 19th century, it was the first phase of migration, mostly by Northern Europeans, German people, Irish people, and that, you know, Southern Europeans. The big migration wave, it started in 1870s. Of course, most of them went to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Latin America. We know that, but also all of a sudden came to the Philippines a lot of Spanish migrants, together with the strengthened Spanish government, strengthened Spanish state that sent also many state workers, many soldiers to the Philippines. You know, to me, the question here probably is the difference with the. I'm trying to say myself what I'm here. Well, you know, so that's why to me this is probably the difference. You know, of course we can think that the mestizos are the most criticized. Of course, they have in some kind of lesser role in the Philippines. The Captain General does not need anymore their council. There are also laws that are against this, and there are, you know, well, the need to be supplanted, to be changed, to be out. However, Inarejo says in one of his articles, although it's not very clear, but it seems that in spite of the laws against the mestizos increased their municipal power. So it was really very difficult to take out them, you know. So well, and then it was the need to change something like their discourse, you know. In this need of change, you know, for instance, the question, well, there's, let us say, the biggest racist in the Philippines, it was Kiao. We can say also I studied about Cañamac, you know, but both of them, you know, there were people that had been on the liberal side in Spain. Kiao had been fighting in the carriage wars against the church, but then when going to the Philippines, they were very clear that they need their help, you know. So it's quite interesting, you know. It's the idea that they cannot take out of the Philippines, they cannot take out the, so to say, the religious discourse from the Philippines, but they have to say anymore, you know. And well, you know, then what we can see here from the 1887 exposition on the Philippines in Spain, we can say that this is the Spanish immigrants are the ones that are going to take progress to exploit the natural riches of the Philippines. They are the ones to make the Philippines progress. This is what they wanted to say, you know. The new discourse to me, you know. And so then the new focus is most on the Sobash, you know. So to me, it's quite important, you know, the inauguration of the 1887 exposition in the Retiro that Rizal criticized so much. So we can see from one side is, let me say, what Spain has already done. They have to recognize the role of mestizos is unavoidable. So we can say, but also on the other side, we have to say what Spain still has to do in the Philippines. You know? Well, to me, it's quite interesting, you know, in the sense that still we need to focus on the Panzamoros, on the Igorrotes, you know. Well, that was a cottage there just in front of a tree, something like to attract the people. They also, for instance, you know, it was in the Retiro, it was the first time that in Spain it was farolas, it was electricity lights at night. So many people went to see the Philippine exposition, to see the representations by the Igorrotes, but also they focus on, you know, for instance, the modernity. Spain for the first time, Madrid for the first time had lights at night, you know. And well, you know, to me it's also important that in the sense that there was a project for a constitution, and we can talk about that, you know, that the Philippines was assimilated not with Cuba or Puerto Rico, but with Equatorial Guinea. So you can see this is from La Ilustración Española y Americana, is the most famous review at this time, when we can see that also this representation of Equatorial Guinea resemble very much those of the Philippines. Okay, so to me, what is interesting in that sense is the new word that it was coined at this time against those Spaniards, but not only against the Spaniard or mestizos, I mean, against anyone who had been living for long in the Philippines, the term aplatanado. Well, to me, it's quite important how the mestizos, you know, from early 19th century, a Russian who visited the Philippines, they say about the mestizos, they look like Spaniards, they speak as Spaniards, they behave as Spaniards. Well, probably we can say, think about the mestizos as different, as says Luis Prat, you know, they appropriated the idioms of the conqueror, you know, but also in the Philippines, it was something like the same new word, meaning about those kind of people that have been living for long in the tropics. In Spain also, it was created the chifladura, craziness that it was followed by the Americans, the demencia americana, isn't it? So, well, it was something like a new way. To me, the big difference between Spain and, you know, what says Kiokiap in that sense is totally opposite to what we say here about the degenerate. Why the degenerates? It was for the poor.
Dr. Rodao, sorry, maybe ask you to wrap up so that we can have time.
Okay, I'm finishing. It's just one word, It's just one. Okay, that's finished. Okay, it's just, this is the end, you know. Well, we end up in 1898. We can say that, to me, I'm very proud that the revolutionaries that they were fighting against the Spanish Empire, he was the first one who claimed against racism, you know. In Cuba, Maceos says for the first time they are no longer blacks or whites, only Cubans, and also Rizal on La Solidaridad. He says also a famous phrase that, well, there are half-breed mestizos, there are Chinese, but we call ourselves only Filipinos. Okay, so thank you very much. I don't want to mingle very much. Excuse me about my delay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodao, and thank you to our other presenters for this part of the panel, Dr. Dizon and Dr. Jose. May we now call on the three speakers for our Q&A. Before I go to the questions, let me just point out that there are certain comments that we find here in our chat box in our Zoom meeting, specifically pertaining to Dr. Dizon's presentation. So Cuauhtemoc posted a few, I think, sources related to the topic. So this is, I think, a journal article, Historia Mexicana. And then Dr. Shalcita also pointed out that the stereotype is that only Spaniards were awarded encomiendas. Thank you, Mark, for showing that this cannot be generalized as something that's universal. And then there's a question also being directed to Mark Dizon. So Mark, Dr. Dizon, based on the records, how effective were the Merdicas and Huachinangos as military combatants? Were they any good, reliable? Oftentimes, penal military units employed by Europeans have a reputation for ferocity and military skill. Does the same hold true for the Huachingangos?
I think for the Guachinangos, the standard literature says no. I think at least if you read I'm not really the expert on these convict soldiers. I think the main sources are, as mentioned in the chat, Maria Fernanda Garcia de los Arcos, Eva Mel, Stephanie Mawson have studied it. But from their studies, from what I can gain, I don't think they were doing. The impression I got from their work is that they were doing very basic manual work. That's the impression that I got. So at least for the Merdicas, maybe you can make that argument because they were given sort of these encomiendas for their skills. But for the Huachinangos, usually the literature is very, very dismal.
Okay, and then I just want to do a quick follow-up on that because there's a comment here posted that Huachinango from Cuauhtemoc also is that Huachinango is the red snapper fish. I would think that the nickname refers to the skin of the soldiers. That's a comment posted by Cuauhtemoc, posted on our Zoom chat box. Now, there's a question here pertaining, I think this pertains to the third presenter, Dr. Rodao. There's the idea, is it the idea of race? Is it the idea of race a colonial construct? And how has the making of race affected the rise of nationalism from Cristina Natividad? And then we will follow that up with from Dr. Shalcita, who wants to ask a question to Dr. Tino. So Dr. Rodao, can you please address the question of Cristina Natividad of race being a colonial construct?
Yeah, but of course, there was always, but to me the most important is something like the legitimacy, the discourse on the race, to this is to me what has been the real way to improve methodologies. I mean, when people like Kyokyap refer that they were of superior race and that science allowed them or told them that they had to rule over the Philippines, this is to me this way of legitimate their wanting to govern to the Philippines or to acquire, let's say this way, this is what to me, this is what has affected more to the Filipino nationalists, in the sense that, well, that person who is criticized by fellow Europeans of being inferior race, that person wants to govern my country. This is what people like Rizal and all the illustrators thought about when people like Kyokyap referred that Filipinos are inferior, this kind of thing, Spain, let me tell you, to me it's more important that Spain did not control the discourses in the Philippines. You have to notice that the Philippines at this time, there was an increase in commerce, and the Filipinos, contrary to many other places, they had more discourses than the Spanish discourse to refer with. So while the Spaniards said, or any colonizer said that I'm your superior, so I have the right to govern your country. In the case of the Philippines, there was many trade, much more foreigners that they could mock the Spanish people like Rizal, people like Quioqueap. They could mock them, saying, no. The Spaniards are considered in Europe as the worst people, the Mediterranean race. Well, in Spain, there were many people who were mocking to the Spaniards at this time, So then they lacked the legitimacy. And also the Filipinos knew the other diverse discourses. Well, for instance, Bonifacio was working for a foreign company. So and the people who came to Spain, people like Rizal and many others who traveled around the world, they knew that what the Spaniards said, it was not true at all. It was not believed by race, by the dominant discourse. So to me, the most important question of the Philippines is that the Filipinos, the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans separated from Spain at the time when the discourse of the races was predominant, when everybody believed that what these racist people, the social Darwinism, was true. This is to me the most important. So to me, it's not the mingling of the people, which is usual, it's the false discourse of the Spaniards. At this time, Filipinos, it was knowing that it was false.
Thank you, Dr. Rodao. But before we turn to Dr. Shasita, just a quick question to Dr. Jose. I think this is posted via our YouTube live stream. Dr. Jose, thank you for the fascinating lecture on the Mestizo de Sangley of Baybay Parian. I'm curious about recent research about the Creole language Español del Parian and its development. Dr. Jose?
I'm not sure. I'm not quite clear about the Creole language, because are we talking about the language in Parian? The language of Parian would be been Chinese. So I think the question is referring to the dictionario that was produced in the Parian. If that's so, then that's a big publication. A manuscript that we have, and the Tsinghua University has made it into a republication that is available from certain bookshops. I'm not sure of that because I have not heard of a Creole spoken in Parian, but it's a Chinese language.
Thank you, Dr. Jose. And now we turn to Dr. Shalsita, who has a question for Dr. Rodao.
I have two questions. One question is, when you talk about mestizo in the 19th century, shouldn't we distinguish between mestizo español and mestizo de Sangley? Because the mestizo de Sangley was economically the powerful sector in Philippine society. I mean, mestizo españoles may have had privileges, but the mestizo de Sangley was really the powerful element. For example, when you talk about Vigan or Pasig or Iloilo, when you talk about the Barrio de los Mestizos, you're really talking about barrio where the affluent mestizos de Sangley lived. Of course, today we forget that. We tend to think of mestizo as pure-blooded Spanish, but in the 19th century, when you use the word mestizo in the Philippines, it was largely the mestizo de Sangley. They were really powerful. Then the other question,
wait.
Yeah.
No, I thank you very much. Of course, I as I said before, I try to avoid something like Chinese mestizo. This is also, and then, but on 19th century, let me tell you that this is something like the critique I can make to the work by Hinarejos. In the sense that he does not distinguish very well between mestizos. I assume he speaks about because his work is quite interesting, looking to the minor details. I like very much Hinarejos, Jose Hinarejos, Juan Hinarejos. But then, still he does not mention about what you are mentioning, something like I think the conclusion by him is something like the increasing municipal power from the mestizos. He does not mention about the mestizos and Sangley. So,
yeah, it's a very important distinction because you can see it right in Vigan. The Father Burgos was mestizo Espanol, but his house is so poor compared to the houses of the Singson and the Ichon and the Siquia in the Barrio de los Mestizos de Sangley. Now, my other question is this. Shouldn't we distinguish between limpieza de sangre, which has to do with religion, and the right to intermarry with non-Spaniards? Because Fernando de Aragon may have emphasized the Inquisition, but he was the padrino when the first Indians came from the Americas. He presided over their baptism. Moreover, he encouraged his soldiers to intermarry with non-Spaniards. And that really has been the pattern in Spanish colonies, intermarriage within the church.
Yeah. And also the need by the administration for money, So, well, all this kind of the way of buying their treatment, their gun, whatever, Of course, this is, I agree very much with you, in the sense that there are many ways to not to abide by general rules. That's for sure, And there are many examples about that. And I in the Philippines also. Thank you very much. I agree totally with you. It was something like in a small talk. I'm really talking very much. I wanted to focus on the late 19th century, And going on with the 19th century with the mestizos, what I feel in late 19th century, it was again a difference with Southeast Asia, while in Dutch East Indies, they something like start to look favorably to the Chinese in the way of something like mediator with the rest of the population. In the case of the Spaniards in late 19th century, the Chinese is another new enemy for them. While the first Spanish treaty with China, it was in 1850. It was something like a way to allow and to increase the Chinese migration to the Philippines. After that, these Spanish immigrants are pretty much against the Chinese because, they have the jobs that usually the Spanish migrants have in any other place. Something like the cook, something like the bread, something like small shops. This was usually taken by Spaniards in all Latin America, but in the Philippines. So, the Chinese is again something like a new enemy, is a new way of enemy. Chinese and of course Chinese mestizo in that sense. Okay, thank you very much.
And Dr. Jose, maybe you may want to weigh in on this issue, since it's a good thing that Dr. Shasita brought up Burgos as a mestizo, but earlier you were talking about mestizos Angles, and this is clearly a different space compared with Ilocos, and a different time compared with the 1800s. So what can you say about the relationship between Mestizo de Sangles and other, specifically Spanish mestizos? Was there anything? Yeah.
My point was, before I began this paper, I was thinking in terms of boundaries and barriers between the various ethnic groups, like the Sangles here, the Christian Chinese, another section. But when I went into further research on the documents, it seems that the barriers were rather fluid, or porous. So that fact, and plus the Indio communities next to the Parian, which increased the mixing of the blood, and the problems that both the Indios and the Mestizo Sangles were met with by certain religious groups, like the groups of Diego Collado, that made them stronger. So I think we have to kind of rethink that Mestizo Sangles with the Indios are a much bigger race than segregating them between Mestizo Sangles and Indios. They're a much bigger group, I think. And that began very early.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jose. And now we turn to Mark. We have a number of questions being thrown at you. One from Dr. Dakudao of the History Department. Would you have an approximate number of these Merdicas and Huachinangos? So that's one. And then another from Cotemoc, what about indigenous Mexicans brought to Guam brought to Guam and the Philippines? They were from Tlaxcala, Nahua speaking language. Apparently they were skillful on construction, particularly on ceramic tiles. And here I have a question from our YouTube live stream for Dr. Dizon. Has there been any research done in Ternate, Cavite, on its language, Chavacano, and possible descendants of its original inhabitants coming from Ternate, Indonesia? So quite a handful.
I think on the first question, the numbers, Stephanie Mawson has studied this. I think the average is about 150 Guachinangos from Mexico in the 17th century, if I'm not mistaken. Merdicas, I haven't read anything on the specific numbers, but in general, not a lot, I would say. Overall, the migration would be minimal. On the indigenous Mexicans who were brought to the Philippines, I'm not aware of it. I haven't done any research about it, so I can't really speak about this. And I think there are studies on the people in Ternate, although it's not really what I study. I study areas farther from Manila, so I haven't really looked into it. But I think there are a lot of studies. I think if you Google searches or something, that a lot of probably. I think there's it's a popular field. Like I think people, especially in linguistics, I think there are a lot of people who have studied the linguistics of Ternate in Cavite. Although I'm not aware of it.
Thank you, Mark. And I think we have room for one or two more questions from our Zoom audience. You may raise your hand virtually via our Zoom room. I think Dr. Bankoff, yes, Greg Bankoff is raising his hand.
Thank you much. I have actually questions for both Mark and Tino, but I'll head for Tino first. Tino, why is this preoccupation with race about whiteness? I mean, what did different Filipinos think about mixed bloods, and what did Chinese think about mixed bloods? I mean, that mestizaje. It's always presented as a question of being more white and being more Spanish, and I just wonder what the other viewpoint is. And my question to Mark is, how did things change, Mark? I mean, I wasn't quite clear exactly what time span you were talking about, and did things change, into the 18th and 19th centuries?
Okay, thanks. I'm very glad to talk to you, Greg.
Nice to see you, Tino.
We always love it when we meet. Hey, no, the question of whiteness. Thank you very much for your question, because it's something like I haven't seen in Filipino texts on talking on whiteness. While in Latin America it's an obsession, total obsession from late 19th century to 1920s, more or less, So it can be one of the difference, honestly, I cannot tell that, but that's true. I haven't seen in the Philippines mentions by Filipinos about whitening there. But anyway, in the context of Latin America, not only, of course, in Cuba, and Puerto Rico, but also in the rest, it was one of the reasons why they explained why they had to allow for immigration from Europeans, because they had to whiten the population. So it was the reasoning by, for instance, Peru and all these countries with a lot of indigenous population, something like the need to mix the population and whiten the population. It was crucial to understand the Latin America at these times is necessary, But thank you very much, because we have to differentiate. In the Philippines, honestly, I don't think probably is too much, Probably it can be something, if we compare the history of the Philippines and Latin America. But thank you very much about your question.
On the time frame, I'm usually looking at the 17th and 18th century. I'm not too sure about the Mardigas, but I would assume a large part of the migration would have happened in the 17th century when they left the forts in the Moluccas. On the other hand, the migration from Mexico, the Guachinangos, I think it was continuous. And I think this is studied by Eagleman. I think she has a book on this. And she points out that by the 18th century, Bourbon ideas of reform, of how the Mexican authorities want to reform sort of the cities of Mexico City, it meant that the composition of the people they were sending out to the Philippines changed. Before it was runaways, criminals, and by the late 18th century, they were sending a lot of vagabonds throughout the city. So there was a changing composition based on the policy that you would have in newspaper.
I think penal battalions in the 19th century too, though I'm not quite sure exactly who they're made up from. Yeah.
I'm not sure about the 19th century because I stopped with the 18th century. Usually I just handle the early modern period and then I stop. So I'm not too familiar with the 19th.
Thank you very much, Greg, for those questions. Now, I just want to raise this point made by Dr. Jose in relation to an earlier question regarding Ternate. Vince Rafael wrote an early article on Ternate Cavite in Philippine Studies. The Cavite Studies people have written monographs on Chabacano in Ternate. The Santo Niño in Ternate is said to have come from there as early as 1663, and there's a rich culture to study there. Now, in relation to that point, Dr. Jose, we have a question from our YouTube live stream. This is a follow-up on the earlier question. The same person who asked about the language in Parian. I was referring to the language spoken in Binondo, Parian, similar to Chavacano indeed, a mix of Hokkien, Spanish, and Tagalog. It's interesting to see Baybayin plus Latin alphabet plus Chinese characters.
Okay. Thank you for that. What happened was in the compilation of the dictionary, it was the Spanish Dominican working with some Chinese from the Parian. So he got a Chinese who spoke Hokkien and another who spoke Mandarin. So that's how they got the pronunciation of the different languages together. It's not really a mixed language, although I forgot the name. There are German scholars who are talking about early Hokkien as a kind of separate language from the Hokkien spoken in China. There are people debating on how different Hokkien was in Manila from the Hokkien in southern China. But the Tagalog words they're not really Tagalog words in this. I don't know. There were Tagalog words incorporated within the Spanish list of words, not in the Chinese words. And then the Chinese just translated these words into the Chinese. They translated the Tagalog words into Chinese, but the Tagalog words were incorporated into the Spanish list. So we had to make that kind of distinction. And so that was very interesting for me because I'm not really into Chinese studies. My field is more into churches. But since the dictionary is with the archives, and I looked into it, and I found that there are indeed these Tagalog words. So it changed my idea of the Chinese people, and knowing and finding out that there are Tagalog words incorporated into this Chinese language. We're working together with the people in Taiwan to develop this discourse on the development of the Hokkien and Mandarin languages in the Philippines. So maybe in another conference, I will be able to share something more about that.
It's an exciting project, Dr. Jose. And on my clock, it's 7:09, but even if we're quite running over time, we can have one more if there's another question from our Zoom participants. Maybe we can have one final question from our Zoom participants. Okay. So if there are none, then thank you very much to all our participants. Thank you for those thought-provoking questions. And of course, thank you to our three presenters, Mark, Tino, and Ricky. We learned a lot about Spanish colonial history, the notions of identity, and how these ideas were indeed fluid during that time. And so, as we wrap up our panel this evening, it's already evening 7 o'clock, I now call on Dr. Nikki Carci Cruz, conference co-convener, to share a few announcements about our conference.
Thank you very much, Mark. Tomorrow, there will be a panel on the idea of Christianity. We will have another long one for 3 hours. Part 1, we'll have Dr. Clotilde Jacquelard, Father Mario Francisco, and Dr. George Manuel Borinaga. And then Part 2, we will have Dr. Agustin Rodriguez, Father Dacanay, and Dr. Patricia Lambino. I hope you could join us. And on Saturday, there will be the Filipino Department's special panel, Panitikan at Pananampalataya, mga pagbasa at pagtatanghal for our foreign guests. That is readings and performances on literature and religion. It will be in the Filipino language, and there will be readings and performances of May Bagyum at May Rilim, Siete Palabras, Pasyon, and Fourth Pilar to accompany the presentations of the speakers. And our final panel for part 2 of the conference will still be on next week on Tuesday. And that final panel will be on the emergence of Filipino identity, to be sponsored by the Modern Languages Department. We hope you could attend all of our events. Thank you very much, Mark. Back to you. I'm sorry, Mike.
It's okay. Thank you, Nikki. And so that concludes our panel 7, difference and identity. We learned a lot about notions of identity. Earlier, we talked about how folklore was a key component in defining Filipino identity during the Spanish colonial period. And in this second part, we learned about how identity, even if we often look at the Spanish colonial period as a period of rigid identities, we saw how fluid categories were. And so we thank our presenters for all their insights. And on behalf of the Department of History and School of Humanities of Ateneo de Manila University, and our partners, CHAM, Centro de Humanidades, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and the National Centennial Commission, I thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you very much and have a great day.